Stone kept the day's sun long after dusk had stolen the red rim from the sea. On the high balcony of the spear tower the stone was warm enough to cradle, and Oberyn Martell leaned against it with bare forearms and let the heat creep into his bones while the night arranged itself in ribbons above the water. The coast below rattled with a late wind. The palms along the loggia tied their fronds into tight knots and shook them loose again, and far beyond, the whisper of surf along the shadow city rose and fell as if the tide breathed. A candle guttered beside him, and the sweet, dull smell of his wine tugged at the back of his throat. The cup balanced in his hand as if it had grown there. He did not drink. He watched the silver wrinkles on the sea where the moon, not yet full, stitched a crooked path eastward. When the door scraped, he did not turn. The door always scraped. The hinges were older than his daughter's. "Your brother sent me," Maester Cailleach said from the threshold. He had the careful cadence of a man who chose not to wake a sleeping infant. "Ask him if he intends to join me tonight," Oberyn said. "I think he expects you to join him," the Maester replied, and there was a smile tucked somewhere beneath the formal tone. The candlelight picked at his chain. The links threw pale glints across the roundness of his cheeks. Oberyn sipped at last and found the wine had gone slightly sour at the rim. He drank anyway and set the cup down on the warm stone. He will be disappointed. A lifetime's habit is not broken by a single summons. "Two, actually," Cailleach said, and something rustled under his cloak. "Parchment. One sealed with the trout and direwolf, and one with an old hawk clutching a key." Beneath the hawk, a thorny vine? Oberyn asked without turning. "Very likely. I am not a gardener." Oberyn smiled and rolled off the edge of the wall, his slippers whispering on the tiles as he crossed the threshold. The room beyond the balcony was dim and quiet. Once, he had painted the plaster with a Myrish scene of narrow towers and arched bridges and veiled women with more bracelets than clothes. Most of it had peeled years ago, and he had not called the painters back. He liked how the ghosts of palm leaves, pressed by day against the whitewash, stenciled their shadows at night. Cailleach was patient, with the patience of small animals. He held out the sealed parchments. The trout and direwolf wax glowed a deep lake red. Oberyn took that one first and rolled it between finger and thumb, feeling the stamp's shallow fissure. "Who brought this?" "A woman with a voice like gravel who did not take off her gloves," the Maester said. "And a boy with hair the color of hay who did not talk at all. They came by skiff and then by mule and then by foot. I was told their boots were so worn they had wrapped their ankles with cloth. They asked for water before they asked for bread. More fools they in this climate," Oberyn murmured. "Ariohota has placed them where they may recover," Cailleach said. "The captain is not gentle with strangers, but he likes to count them." Oberyn looked past him to the door. "And the hawk?" Cailleach's mouth twitched. "No carrier, that one. A courier with too much saddle for his horse and a little too much pride for his task. He came under the name of a merchant of salt cod and left under the name of a mason who builds ovens." Ariohota did not trouble to correct him. "Let us keep the hawk caged a moment," Oberyn said, and broke the first seal. The parchment smelled faintly of damp straw and iron. Inside, the script was narrow and clean, the habit of someone who bothered to cross their T's exactly and took no pleasure in tails or flourishes. The words announced themselves as though they were standing in a cold hall, hands clasped behind their backs. "To Prince Oberyn Nymeros Martell of Sunspear." He read it once and then again without moving his lips. He felt Dorne in the room around him, dry from corner to corner. The night's heat climbed his ribs like a ladder. He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. Cailleach waited. He knew better than to ask. "Tell my brother I will come," Oberyn said at last. He slipped the letter into his sleeve as if it were a knife. "Tell him that if he makes me climb to his damnable chair, I will complain like a grandmother. Tell him to have a cushion ready that is not one of those absurd lemon-scented things the cooks use to perfume their hands." "Your brother's lemon-scented cushions are in the kitchen," Cailleach said mildly. "These days he prefers cedar." "Cedar, then. A prince's backside deserves soft wood." As Cailleach turned to go, Oberyn plucked the second letter from his hand. The hawk's seal was more deeply cut. It had left a beveled bird with a narrow eye in the wax. The parchment creaked when he flexed it. He broke it with his thumb. The script was elegant and practiced, the hand of someone who had learned to write as a way of giving orders. He read, smiled once, and tucked that one away too. Doran was not in the throne room. He was where he was always as after dark, when his joints were stiff and his breath was a little short. At the highest balcony that was not so high as to make his head swim. He had rolled his chair to the arch and set his hands on the arms. His fingers were long and, tonight, a little pale. The moon put a nickeled edge on each nail. "You have a visitor," he said without turning, addressing the night. "One who complains of stairs," Oberyn said, walking into the circle of the moon's attention. Ariohota stood as a figure in the deeper dark behind Doran. His long-hafted axe folded against his back. He made no sound. No one had ever accused Ariohota of making unnecessary noise. "I sent Caliot," Doran said. "If he is not enough to fetch you, little brother, I must offer you a feast of urgencies." "Maester Caliot is like the tide," Oberyn said. "If I ignore him, he will still arrive. You might have sent Arianne. She would have come with arguments," Doran said. "And you are not so easily moved by those." "By what then?" Oberyn asked. He crossed to the parapet and leaned beside his brother, looking past him to the water. The moon had come up a little. The silver path was smoother now, less broken by the water's skin. A lantern moved along the shadow city's edge, a firefly nested in a jar. "By a promise that tastes of iron," Doran said. "Men have bled themselves dry on the taste of iron," Oberyn said. "And Arianne would have arrived with barley cakes and sweet wine, and that clever little glance she thinks I don't see." "She would have told you to be cautious," Doran said. Oberyn laughed. "She would have told me to be careful with you." He lifted his sleeve and withdrew the first letter. "She is not wrong." Doran accepted the parchment without looking at him, slid his long fingers across it, and then handed it back. "I have already read it," he said. "And the other?" "Then we need not waste breath upon summaries," Oberyn said. He put the letter away again. "The North wishes to speak with us, and the hawk would have us do nothing but speak our prayers. The one has the smell of smoke and running horses. The other smells of fresh wax and good dinners and men who sleep over their boots and snore into their wine." "Tyrell," Doran said softly. "Tywin," Oberyn corrected, and the names twisted together like vines in his mouth. "He does not write in his own hand, I think. He does not need to. The ghost of him sits in every letter he sends. Nevertheless, it has his shoulders." Doran rested his head against the chair's back and closed his eyes a little. Exhaustion pinched his mouth. "If you wanted to satisfy the North, what would you ask them?" "To deliver me the mountain trust like a boar," Oberyn said without heat. "And his dog and the men who added laughter to the sacking of a nursery. To give me 3 days and a quiet room and a steel bowl, and to stand outside the door and not speak until I have spoken first." "And if you wanted to satisfy the hawk?" Doran asked. Oberyn lifted one shoulder. "To do nothing as he requests. To let him keep his dinners and his wax and his snoring." "You think the North can succeed?" Doran said. Oberyn tilted his head. "I think the North has already succeeded in one thing, making enemies of the Lannisters. And in our family, that counts for more than small merit." "Obligations chain us," Doran said. "When our men ride, they ride to our drum. And when our drums sound, we must live with the echoes. A single drum in the right valley can make 2 armies hold their breath," Oberyn said. He smiled. "If we beat it with wit." "Your wit has paid hospital bills," Doran said, and even in the dark his tone was gentle. "Do not spend it as if there were no empty rooms in Sunspear." "My wit has carried me to every empty room I chose," Oberyn replied. He let his own voice soften. "Brother, the North's letter does not only ask for a sword. It sends tidings, yes, and hunger, and an honesty I am not accustomed to from those who call themselves kings. There are no gold knobs on their words. They do not ask me to kiss a ring. They ask for terms, for justice, for the chance that things might not always bend the way the fat men in the middle imagine they will. They offer a marriage, Doran said. Oberyn swallowed without drinking. They offer the idea of one. That is the skin of it, Doran said. The meat is... He lifted a hand and let it drop. Walder Frey. Yes, Oberyn said, and now he did drink, because the taste of wine was less sour than the name. Walder Frey, his brood, his bridges, his greed. He has something of an old wasp in a window about him. You would think he would have died in his own bitterness by now. The North is already promised to him, Doran said. The boy, King Robb, is promised by oath and by need. He needs a crossing. He will need a crossing again. Necessity rubs words away, Oberyn said, and then shrugged. Or writes new ones. They do not speak only of the boy. It is a wide house, the wolves, a sister, an uncle, and our Aryan, whose smile is more blade than blossom. She is not a token. She is our heir. Doran was quiet long enough for the night to shift. Somewhere below a horse nickered, and the streets answered with the thin calls of late traders. We are not bargaining for a pretty wedding, Doran said. We are bargaining for years, for decades, for our vengeance, which is patient or else it is not vengeance at all. I know, Oberyn said. Do you? Doran's breath was not unkind. Because the letter in your sleeve asks you to move like a viper through scrub, strike once and slide away, while the hawk's letter asks you to sit on a branch and count your feathers. You take delight in the first. You despise the second. But you should at least remember that sometimes branches bend, and sometimes the scrub catches fire, and sometimes it is only the water that wins, wearing down the rocks you loved into sand. Your metaphors are improving, Oberyn said. Perhaps the Maester's books are finally paying a return. I have had long to read, Doran said. He sighed. You will go north. Were you only making conversation until you reached the decision you had already made? Oberyn asked. Yes, Doran said. He opened his eyes. And because I am your elder brother, you will pretend to have arrived there first. Oberyn bowed his head. Not greatly, but greatly enough. I will take a small company, he said. Quiet men, quick women, no banners that can be counted from a league away. I will go by the Prince's Pass, where the road is narrow and those who watch us will have to watch from close enough that they will need to remember what my face looks like when their masters ask them for the story later. Take Areo, Doran said. Areo will not be made to fit into any sack. Aaron said, glancing back toward the dark shape with its iron rod of an axe. He is a banner whether he wants it or no. The sight of him has kept more knives in more sheaths than you know, Doran said. I do not ask because I doubt your capacity for violence, Oberyn. I ask because when men who do not love us cannot see what stands at our back, they forget themselves. Areo Hoda's voice was very low when he spoke at last. It had the deepness of a drum at a distance. I go where my prince goes, he said, and he did not bother to specify which one. Oberyn nodded once. So it is done, he said. I will ride at dawn. Doran made a small motion with his fingers, the movement of a man who has learned to ask rather than command. At dawn, yes, and leave the hawk to me. The hawk will not like being left, Oberyn said. The hawk will write another letter, Doran said, and closed his eyes again. And another, and another. Every man must practice the skill that is his. Oberyn stood with the night on his shoulders, thinking of iron and oil and the cold taste of steel bowls. He thought of a young man who called himself a king and a mother who had chewed her grief into strength and a river that ran wider than any road. He thought of a marriage like a lattice that vines might climb or strangling weeds might not around. He thought of the long march past mountains he did not love and the smell of rain that visited those mountains twice a year and no more. Brother, he said, and when Doran opened his eyes again, Oberyn was smiling with only one corner of his mouth. I will bring you an answer as crooked and necessary as a branch near water. Before dawn, the courtyards of Sunspear were a map of shadows. Those shadows moved as his company gathered. 10 out of Planky Town who understood the sea and the way it sent carried along a road. 6 from the Greenblood who had learned patience from the slow river and the way it wandered. 3 from Starfall who carried themselves as if the moon had told them a secret. A dozen from the desert with their faces wrapped because a man who respected the sun covered what the sun would take. And a handful of women whose knives had names they did not share. Nymeria, one of his daughters, and the one he loved for her willingness to wear silk and steel without apologizing for either, rode out to the gate along with them and held the reins of his horse while he adjusted the strap of his spear. "If you bring me back a Lannister hand," she said, "I will hang my jewels from it." "Not a foot," Oberyn asked. "Their feet are not elegant," she said. "I have never liked the way their shoes squeak." Tyene kissed his cheek, her hands soft, her eyes sly. "Bring me back stories instead," she said. "Hands rot. Stories can be polished." Obara had already gone to the yard to spar with Ario's men, and when Oberyn paused at the edge of the stables, she broke off mid-stride and came to him with her practice spear tucked beneath one arm. "If you have need of me, call," she said. "Even if you do not need me, call." "I will, but then you will come even if I tell you not to," he said. "Of course," she said, grinning a mouthful of white teeth. "Do not stab anyone interesting without me." Ario Hota mounted as if the horse had been carved for him. The captain had the stillness of a tower with a man in it, and the horse stepped carefully under that weight. Oberyn glanced once up the long face of the spear tower. Arianne watched from a window with her arms crossed over the sill, her hair braided back in thick ropes. She did not wave. She did not smile. She tilted her head as if she had put his path on a scale and was waiting for the sand to settle. When they filed out of Sunspear, the first light had not yet softened the sky. The desert at that hour was not a sheet of fire but a memory of it. The air held only a little heat like a cup that had cooled. The gates opened for them and then closed with a weight that made the ground transmit a small tremor into Oberyn's ankles. They took the road to Skirich and the Prince's Pass because that was the way a traveler with an honest face would go. The raiders and the men with too many initials in their names preferred the Bone Way, where a man could be thrown down a canyon and not be found by anything but lizards. Oberyn did not intend to be thrown down anywhere. He intended to climb. Within the first day, the flat scrub gave way to buckled rock and thorn. The mountains rose up with the stubborn shape of old men. Wind in the pass came on a narrow axis, cutting one cheek and not the other, and left grit in the corners of their eyes. The horses learned the angle and tucked their heads. At midday, a hawk drifted above them on a line of air. It wheeled when the road bent and gazed down with a single silver coin of an eye. By the second day, the company had learned to ride without speaking and to make fires with low smoke, to eat flatbread with olives and brine cheese, and to share the skins with measured swallows. Ario Hota smelled the wind and, without words, lifted 2 fingers. The line of riders narrowed. On a cliff not far ahead, for men watched with their elbows on their knees. They were dressed in dust, which is to say they were dressed in nothing anyone could name. Oberyn did not change his pace. He rode into the angle of their gaze as if he were a man going to market to buy pomegranates. Ario's horse shifted a little closer to his, and Oberyn could feel the captain's calm like a cooled blade. On the cliff, the watchers stood and came down the goat's path single file, not hurrying and not dawdling. The leader had a beard that had gone gray at the chin only, as if his heat were escaping through that one place. He kept his hands at his sides. "Good day, travelers," he said when he reached the road. "It is not hot enough to be good," Oberyn said and let his horse breathe. "Only adequate. It will be less adequate beyond the bend," the man said, showing a sliver of tooth. "Then we will pause and prepare to be unimpressed," Oberyn said. The man's eyes shifted past him to Ario Hota and the axe's familiar crescent. Men always did that. It was like watching someone remember his mother's hand on his ear, long after the mother had died. The man licked his lips. "Toll," he said, but it was suddenly not so confidently said as it would have been before. "For the safety of those who pass." "Safety paid for by those who intend to take it," Oberyn said. He shifted his leg and the horse moved a step nearer. "You can smell him," he added, and then the edge of his smile appeared. "If you stand downwind. His axe has cut men who never washed." The gray-chinned man smiled despite himself. It was involuntary and therefore trustworthy in a way. "Names," he said. "Birds have them," Oberyn said. "Horses also. My men usually use mine only when I have done something foolish or they wish to sell me to someone for a price." "Sell you?" The man repeated with interest he didn't bother to bury deeply. "I go cheaply," Oberyn said. "I have expensive appetites, so I must afford them by every means." Hoda gazed past the man at nothing. His silence arranged itself into a wall between Oberyn and anything sharp that might be thrown. At last, the man's shoulders made the tiny dip that meant the calculation had been done and found both answers costly. "Then pass," he said. "Adequate day to you." "Adequate?" Oberyn said, and touched his horse with his heel. They climbed for 6 more days through switchbacks and stone arches and places where wind had carved the rock into folded curtains. They passed Ironwood men in pairs who pretended not to recognize Oberyn and did not offer him wine in public but sent skins to their camp after dark with a little note tied to each neck. "May your blade only drink when you wish it to." They crossed a curve of the pass where the snow still lay in a gray gutter like the last memory of winter slipping down an old man's throat. They descended at last into land that began to remember grass. At Skirich, their small parley was a kind of ritual performed without recital. Oberyn let Areo do the speaking. Areo could make a single sentence sound like a gate that would open only if you came to it with honest arms and empty hands. Men with worries carved into their faces listened and nodded. They understood that the prince was traveling with a private company, that his travels were for his own heart and not a declaration of Dorne's army moving. They understood that soldiers who moved quietly were not always less dangerous than soldiers whose drums could be heard for a morning's march. They understood, too, the cost of Dorne Martell's patience. It settled on the table with the bread. It sat in the corner of the room like a cat. They reached the marches and moved past them. The land opened to rolling hills turned by plow and then left to stubble because the men who would have harvested were holding spears elsewhere or lying on planks beneath oiled cloth. Villages, as they climbed north, were quieter than they should have been. The dogs barked at them as if it were their first chance in days. Children peered around doorposts and shoved each other as if they were rehearsing an old play. The air smelled of turned earth, and sometimes old smoke, and the pungent salt of horse sweat, and once the abrupt high sweetness of a pear orchard that had forgotten war for the space of a morning and dropped fruit as if the world were not burning at its edges. By the time they reached the river that was called a fork but seemed more like a cousin, with muddy shoulders, slow elbows, a refusal to hurry, the news had come down in shreds and pieces. A red lion had been seen in the eaves of a field. A gold stag had been painted over in dung. A boy had been hanged for taking a loaf. A man had been hanged for cutting the boy down. The man and the boy swung together while a woman beat her hands into 2 useless things on the ground beneath them. Oberyn collected the stories because they had the sour taste of iron in them, and he wanted to know how much iron was already leaching into the soil in places he had never loved and would now be asked to love as though they were his mother's footstool. He listened with that light tilt of head he used when the music grew interesting. He asked no questions where questions would cost shame. He asked one where shame was the thing needed. He asked for bread and paid for it. He drank rough beer because there was nothing else. He slept with his spear across the base of his bed with its blunt end propped against the wall so anyone who came through the door would trip and lose a tooth. On the 10th night away from the spear tower, he lay awake listening to a weathered shutter knock against a cottage wall. A woman had given them half her rafters to sleep under, and if the rafters had listened, they would have cracked with the weight of Hoda. The cottage was a place that had been used for mending nets and now mended men's feet. The host had 2 sons, both gone. The younger had cut his shin as a child and he had shown Oberyn the scar as if it were a coin he kept hidden, though now his leg, if he still had it, might be a worse map. Oberyn stared at the thatch and thought of Arian's face at the window, of Doran's hand on the arm of his chair, of Elia's laugh, which had been like light on water because it always arrived as if from 2 angles at once, of a small boy with black hair and a small girl who had loved cats, both folded into a story strangers would wash with their mouths for years until it became clean enough to pass to children again. Rage is a kind of hunger. It eats all meals and cannot tell a pear from a heart. In the morning, He rose and performed the short rituals of moving, checking the straightness of the spear's shaft, speaking to his horse, lowering himself to a squat to feel his heels too. Ch the ground, eating the first bite without tasting it so the second might be honest. The company set out while the mist lay in a sheet over the fields. When the sun lifted, it turned the mist into small jewels that did not have the patience to be jewels for long. By mid-morning they saw the great bulk of the castle across the water and felt the change in the air that men feel when they approach a place with deeper fences than hedgerows. Banners moved along the top of the red stone. Armor glinted. The drawbridge chain creaked with a slow metal rhythm that men are born knowing is not the sound of any instrument that brings joy. A canoe came for them across the brown water with two men who rowed as if their hands had done nothing else. They did not do Oberyn the disrespect of looking at Ariohoda first. They looked at Oberyn. They looked at his spear. They looked at the company and counted as best they could with their eyes. They brought them to a postern dock where a platform had been built atop water logs that creaked and shifted like knees. Oberyn stepped from boat to wood with a speed that told men he did not fear drowning and a care that told them he preferred other ways to die. Inside the castle, they walked through a wedge of shade that had already collected the day's heat and was hoarding it for later. The air had the smell of old stone and wet straw and the faint background of river. In a hall paneled with oak dark enough to drink light, a man waited whose face was built of bones with no decorations. His hair was iron and his eyes were not. He wore a cloak the color of night on a winter sea. "Lord Brynden," Oberyn said. "Prince Oberyn," the man acknowledged, and his mouth did not move after that as if it would waste valuable expression on courtesy. His gaze traveled along the company and stopped and acknowledged Ario with the smallest nod that could be done without missing nothing. "My niece will see you first, the king after. Our way." Oberyn inclined his head as if that were the only way the world might proceed. Brynden Blackfish turned and led them along corridors that bent unexpectedly like river meanders. On the walls a fish leapt eternally from carven water. The carver had imagined the moment just before and the one just after and placed them side by side so the fish seemed to split and conjoin with each step. Oberyn admired it. He admired the tenacity of artisans who made beauty in a time when it could be crushed in a day by a mounted boot. In a smaller chamber where the windows began high and admitted only a clean rectangle of sky each, she waited with hands that had already learned to hide their tremors by folding themselves over a cloth. Her hair had streaks of salt in it at the temples that had not been there when she was younger, which had not been long ago in any calendar that was kind. Her mouth was not made for smiling and therefore he believed her when she did not. "Lady Caitlin," he said. "Prince Oberyn," she said. Her voice had a husk that was not dryness but fatigue hammered into a tool. "You have come far. I have measured it at each dawn," he said, "and found it more than enough. Your river is wide. Your road is stubborn. Your people are hungry." Her eyes moved. He saw then how green they were, like river bottle glass when sun passes through it. "You have not come with banners," she said. "My brother did not send me with them," he said. "I come as a man might come who brings not an army but a set of questions and a purse with enough coin to buy justice if it is for sale. I do not sell it," she said, and the ripples of anger in the room made the air bend around them. "I did not think you would," Oberyn said, and the edge of his smile softened. "Which is why I came." She watched him for a time that could have been counted or not. The little movements of her face were not chosen, but they were contained. He understood most and guessed at the rest. She was a woman who had been asked to carry more than any one person was built to bear, and had done it by bending in ways that did not break the bones but would leave a pain when storms approached. He had known women like her and men unlike them, and he knew which group the world would rather own. "My son will speak with you in an hour," she said at last. "I asked to see you first so I could look at you without the press of men who like to hear themselves argue. They are not bad men. They are simply loud. And it is hard to listen to the water with a drum beside you," Oberyn said. Something like a smile came and then left her mouth. "Once I told my son he should be young longer," she said. "He declined and here we are. Many boys are pressed into the mold of men," Oberyn said. Fewer men press themselves into the shape the world does not expect of them. They tend to make enemies and songs. Songs are not soup, she said, and then she reached for the cloth she had been holding and turned it over in her hands. He saw then that it was not a cloth but a small shirt a child might wear beneath a heavier one. The seams had been mended with thin, exact stitches. She caught his eyes. "Forgive me," she said, and the words wanted to crack. "We all bring something with us. Carry what you must," Oberyn said. "You will set it down when it is time, or you will teach someone else to carry part of it. Both are honorable." She inclined her head in acknowledgement of the courtesy and the presumption at once. "You want the man they call the Mountain," she said, like a physician who names a tumor. "You want him to die a certain way." "I want him to arrive a certain way," Oberyn said. "If I must be particular, death will attend on its own schedule." "Your sister," she began and stopped, and then continued as if the words themselves had a right to air. "Your sister died in a way that would unmake the quiet of any mother who thinks about it too long. I have thought about it too long. There is no argument to be against your desire." He tasted blood at the edges of his thought. He let the taste sit, not swallowing it, trusting that to push it back wholly would be to flood the room with something that would float all their papers away. "Not an argument," he said. "A caution? A price? Which you will name." "I will name several," she said. "One is Walder Frey. One is the need for men. One is oats. One is my son's heart, which sometimes goes faster than the council around him and sometimes goes with it, and I do not always approve of either speed. One is a letter from the south that promises dinners and wax and snoring." Oberyn laughed softly. She had read the room even in the night. "He writes to everyone who matters," he said. "And he writes to some who do not, in case we do not know who we are." "Your brother," she said, and the word had respect and a question inside it. "Wishes to sit long," Oberyn said, and let warmth fill that answer because he did not owe the world his brother's marrow. "He will not be moved by the promise of quick vengeance. He can be moved by the promise of a particular kind of alliance made of braid rather than rope." "You speak of my son," she said. "I speak of possibilities," he said. "Your son has his oath. He has his need. He is a king made in a wind that turned wild. Your house has other branches. Your brother, your daughters." He watched her carefully as he said the last. The air was very still. No banner moved in the hall. Somewhere a man carried a pail that slopped. "My daughters are not for sale," she said gently, as if she were reminding him of a rule she expected him already to know. "Nor are ours," he said. "The difference between a sale and a covenant is the weight carried on both sides. I am not here to bargain with girls like bolts of silk. I am here to describe a path along which two great houses might place feet until they are accustomed to walking side by side. Your house has long memories," she said, "and long shadows. Shadows keep men from burning if they are wise," Oberyn said. She stood. The movement was precise and cost her something. He felt the effort as one feels a current. "We will eat," she said. "You will speak to my son." She took up the child's shirt and placed it on a stool as if it were a relic. "You will say what you want. He will say what he can give. And then we will all try to make a bridge from two banks that were not built to love one another." He bowed slightly, not so much to acknowledge her authority as to acknowledge the work. "We will do as you suggest." When he saw the king in the north, he thought at once. Too young. He had thought it when the letter came, and he thought it again now. He did not mean weak. He did not mean foolish. He meant that the flesh over the bones still had a certain newness to it, a sheen that had not yet been scrubbed and scratched by disappointment. The boy, add the crown and the title and the braided wolves, and still boy, stood rather than sat and had a grave gaze. He had his father's quiet jaw. He had hands that wanted to be doing something. "You're far from home," Robb Stark said, and if he offered courtesy it had a rough edge because the knife had not been polished by court. "I am often far from home," Oberyn said. "The desert made me into a man who does not mind sleeping under different stars so long as I can still count them. And the stars here are not the same. Robb said. They are, Oberyn said. You own neither those nor your enemies. The arrangement differ. The pieces are the same. Robb's mouth made the movement of someone who files that away for later. Why did you come? He asked. I mean truly, because I do not like men who believe that a certain kind of cruelty is a reasonable soup to serve at a grand table, Oberyn said. Because your letter was honest enough to be ugly in places. Because your mother is tired and still stronger than most men I know. Because my country is careful and I am not always careful. Because my sister's ghost has never learned to sit. Robb nodded. He set his knuckles on the table and leaned into them as if the wood needed to be reminded of a man's weight. What can you bring me? He asked, plain as weather. A plan you will not love, Oberyn said. And people you will learn to love if you live long enough. Tell me, Robb said. Not banners, Oberyn said. Not at first. My brother will not lift his banners for you until he believes the weight of the world has shifted such that it will not crush him beneath them. But he does not need to lift all banners to bend the air around them. Dorne can press the marches and harry the fat lands in a way that keeps your enemies feeding someone other than the king in the capital. Dorne can salt the letters with their patience. Dorne can hire men to cut ropes and burn certain storehouses and speak to certain captains in the stepstones whose loyalties are measured in metal and in the distance between storm and port. Dorne can send me. I am not an army. I am a set of choices that can make other men doubt the comfort of their habits. You are asking me to keep fighting without you at my side, Robb said. I am telling you that you cannot afford to lift me onto your horse and call the war one, Oberyn said. I am not a Tyrell host. I am not a river flooding. If you want to win quickly, marry the hag at the Twins and pray that quickness is the virtue you think it is. If you want to win at all, learn where your enemy eats. Walder Frey is not a hag, Robb said reflexively, and then allowed a thin smile because he was a boy with a sense of the beams of a room. He is prickled. Prickles are the part of a plant that goes into your skin when you touch it the wrong way, Oberyn said. And then, when you move, they break off and are difficult to remove. You can leave them there. You can let them fester. Or you can learn to lift the plant by the stem. Robb looked at the blackfish. Brynden Tully's mask of a face admitted nothing. He had taken a position at Oberyn's left hand where he could watch both the prince and the boy. Two men who would be old one day stood on either side of a table that had seen better arguments. I have sworn, Robb said, and he did not have to name it. The crossing and the marriage that was already a chess piece placed. I have sworn, Oberyn said, and for a moment he allowed the weight of Elia and Doran and the desert and his own name to sit upon the table. A man is not made of one oath. He is made of the way he chooses which oath to follow when the oaths contradict and the weather turns. Catelyn Stark sat in a chair that did not look comfortable but seemed to fit the shape of her back. If not banners, she said, then hostages. The word makes any mother ill, but it is the currency in the purse at hand. Will your brother send us someone who can sit in our halls and eat our bread and be worth enough to make your house balk at betrayal? Send, Oberyn said. No. Offer? Yes. I have a daughter. Catelyn's eyes moved not in shock but in a new calculation. Robb's mouth opened and closed, and then he looked away to a point on the wall where generations of Tullus had sought better points in conversation and not found them there. Brynden's eyes sharpened like a knife edge run against leather. Not to you, Oberyn added dryly, and Robb coughed despite himself. To your halls. Not as a hostage. As a guest we will not lose. You will treat her as the law requires and as courtesy improves. And you will know that my brother's heart will sit more upright when he imagines her eating in a room with your mother than when he imagines my letters going unanswered. In time, if the braid holds, we can talk about more shameful kinds of bargaining. For now, I offer you a woman who will not spy for us but whose presence will make us honest. You will not use her to whisper, Catelyn said. I have daughters enough to whisper, Oberyn said. This one will bring her spear and her humor and her ability to make men who think they are invisible remember that they are wearing boots. You jest at your own expense, Brynden said, and it was not a compliment or an accusation. merely an observation of a fact the way one might observe a horse's knees. I buy more with it than with coins, Oberyn said. We will also send money, and certain men who can light fires that do not look like fires. And I will give you this. He tapped his spear against the wood, and the sound made everyone's shoulders stiffen in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with memory. A promise that if you can deliver me the mountain in chains and alive, I will guarantee that no ship with a Dornish banner will ferry 1 ear of grain into any port that flies the lion's flag. I will make small kingdoms of hunger and gift them to the men who wear red cloaks and think they cannot be hungry because their larders have locks. Robb's knuckles whitened and then loosened. You talk like a man who is used to counting the number of steps between laughter and murder, he said. I like it better than polite lies. Lies do not feed dogs, Oberyn said. I have tried. They spit them up like gristle. Robb drew a long breath. He was so young and he was trying so hard. It made Oberyn's own mouth tighten in a way that had nothing to do with sorrow and everything to do with irritation at the universe's habits. My Lord Prince, the boy said, and the title did not sound wonderful in his mouth. It sounded like a stone he had to push up a hill and had done so willingly. If I accept that, I must break something I promised a man on a bridge. If I accept your daughter into my hall, I must ask her to be brave in a way that shames men. If I ask you for the mountain, I must expose my men to his butcher's hands until we can bind them. You must do all those things, Oberyn said. You must also convince a lord with 100 grandchildren that he will have 1,000 by next winter if he keeps his word and 10 if he breaks it. You must feed men who will not eat for pride unless you make pride taste like beef. You must use your mother's patience until it rattles and then let her rest. You must lose less than the other man loses. If you want to be a king and not just the story men tell about a king, you must learn to choose between ugly and uglier. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Catelyn said, almost to herself, We will need a raven. You will need many, Brynden said dryly. Robb's mouth shaped a line. If I send a raven to the twins, he said, it will return with a meal eaten. If I ride there, I may never ride away. Then choose a third path, Oberyn said. There are never third paths, Robb said with sudden heat, the boy rising beneath the crown. There are always more paths, Oberyn said quietly. They are simply narrow, and men think themselves too large to walk them. He took the spear and leaned it in the crook of his arm. Consider this, make a feast, not to honor Walder Frey, who would rapidly die of a glut of honor were it served to him with every course, but to honor your men. Make it in the meadow south of his bridge. Invite the Freys to eat at your tables. Seat his best loved at your right hand and his resentful bastards on your left. Speak to the one who is not listened to and make him feel as if he is the hottest coal in the fire. Arrange for music that is a little too fine for a man who does not believe he has ever danced. Then, when he sees that your tent is warmer and your soup is better and your men are less hungry, ask him to walk with you. Not to bargain. To walk. Offer him something he cannot measure. Ask him to remember that he will die and that his name will be placed on a stone, and that he can choose whether the names beneath his will be many or few. If he is the sort of man to whom this speaks, you will have done something no war ever teaches. If he is not, then you will have at him as one feeds wolves outside the fence when winter is long. Sometimes that is enough. It was not a plan that could be counted or measured with the weight of grain. It was a plan that nudged. Catelyn's eyes softened for a heartbeat and then sharpened again. Brynden Tully looked half impressed and half disgusted. Robb breathed out and into himself again, and Oberyn knew the boy had already accepted the part of the idea that was not the idea, that he would need to be larger than one promise and smaller than his own rage. The king in the north extended his hand. It was not a courtier's gesture. It was the hand of a boy who had skinned knees climbing a tree with bark that had bitten him because he had not been careful. Oberyn took it, and the clasp was hard enough to be honest. We will eat, Robb said. And while we eat, you will tell me what your men have done to make captains in the Stepstones more interested in their purses than in the colors they show. And then you will tell me what you need from me to put a rope around the mountain's throat. Alive, Oberyn said. Alive, Robb echoed. and looked as if he were committing himself to carrying a wolf through a winter he did not yet know the length of. They feasted that night in a fashion that owed more to discipline than to abundance. The trenchers were not lavish. The ale was bitter but clean. The men sat in long rows and used their elbows cleverly so that the bread did not fall into the gravy. A musician above the hall door had a lute that sounded like dry wood wrapped in a string and managed nevertheless to coax a tune from it in which joy wrestled stubbornly with resolve and did not lose. At the high table, Oberyn watched the faces, not the plates. He saw where the eyes traveled when a woman carried in a platter, how a man's mouth tightened when another's laugh came too close to his ear, how the blackfish kept the conversation from sliding into the ditch with 4 words placed as if he was moving stones along a path to prevent a horse's stumble. Catelyn Stark ate with the constraint of a penitent and the politeness of a hostess who refuses to force others to feel guilt at her hunger. Robb drank once more than he should and then stopped himself with a small, embarrassed grin that a man might make when he has remembered that his boots should be clean even if no one is visiting. After the first course, Oberyn excused himself and walked the inner corridor alone with his spear, the iron tip wrapped so that it would not scratch the stone. The hall's old tapestries narrowed the air and warmed it. On one, a fish leapt toward a crown held by a man whose expression had cracked with time, so that he seemed perpetually startled. Oberyn paused. Across from that surprising king was a patch of bare wall. He leaned his shoulder against the stone just there and waited. "Your men behaved," Brynden Tully said, emerging from the angle of a doorway where he had been no doubt watching more than the tapestries. He had the cleverness to act as if he had not surprised anyone by appearing. Ariohoda had not moved closer, but Oberyn knew he could have reached him in 6 steps. Bryndon's gaze flicked to the wrapped spear point and returned to Oberyn's face. "I did not expect less." "They are not children," Oberyn said. "Children are easier," Brynden said dryly, and put his shoulder against the opposite wall. They faced each other across the corridor, 2 men who understood the use of stillness. "Your plan for the twins is not stupid," Brynden added after a time. "It has the flaw of resting on a human heart, which is an unreliable engine. But we do not have coal." "You have bread," Oberyn said. "It is as useful in its fashion." "We have less of it than we need," Brynden said. He did not sigh. He did not do anything so declarative. He merely made a small movement with his mouth that admitted the taste of ash. "You will send your daughter?" "Yes," Oberyn said. "She will require a room that locks on the inside and a window that can be reached by a ladder lowered from above," Brynden said, as if he were describing a new mill wheel. "She will require women who will call her by name and not by title, and a man at her door who looks as if he does not see women at all." "Ario," Oberyn said. "I had thought of that," Brynden said. "But your captain cannot stand at her door and your own. Choose which you care to protect with his shadow." "My brother will ask the same question," Oberyn said. "I will tell him I can make a shadow out of my own breath." Brynden smiled for the first time. Not friendly, not cruel. Simply the little movement a man makes when he is impressed despite himself. "You speak well," he said. "I do not always mean all of it," Oberyn said. "That is the trick." "Will Doran Martell lift a banner for my nephew?" Brynden asked. "Perhaps," Oberyn said. "Perhaps not. I am not his hand. I am his brother. He trusts me to light a certain kind of fire and avoid burning down the barn." "Can you do it?" Brynden asked. "Usually," Oberyn said, "unless the barn is built of poetry." Brynden pushed off the wall. "You are a dangerous man to have at one's table," he said. "Too many men will want to stab you, and too many will want to sit nearer in hopes of catching what it is you own." "What I own," Oberyn said, "is a kind of anger that does not go cold even when the wine does." "Keep it," Brynden said. "We will use it, carefully." They returned to the hall and ate the meat they had been served and did not complain that it was tougher than their teeth preferred. Oberyn told Robb stories about captains who had stared at coin and then at flags and decided one or the other depending on the angle of the wind the previous season. Robb asked the quick, unpolished questions of a boy who was trying to gather all knowledge into 2 hands. Oberyn showed him how to let one thing fall so that another might be caught. Catelyn listened and folded her cloth. Biar. Indon counted how many times each man laughed and made a different count of how many times each man did not when he should have. When the feast had ended and the hall had been cleared and the men had drifted out talking of horses and boots and whether a certain sausage had been better than the one at the last feast, Catelyn approached Oberyn and stood where he could see her face and where the dying fire would not catch the prickle of tears and make a spectacle of them if they came. "I had a friend once," she said, "who told me that if you can see 3 moves ahead at a table you will never be poor, and if you can see 4 you will sometimes be king. I think you were born sitting at a table." "I was born at the edge of a bed that smelled of lemons," Oberyn said. "If the table was in the room, I do not remember it." She tilted her head and gave him that small, real smile again, the one that did not require her to be anyone's idea of gracious. "The mountain," she said. "We will need him." "You will need someone who knows his habits," Oberyn said. "Where he sleeps when he is not sleeping, who feeds his horse and how much, where he likes to stand when he is waiting to kill, so that he can persuade his feet that the ground will not move beneath him before he moves it for others. We have men who know those things," she said. "We have men who tracked him by the road he leaves behind him. We have men who have done nothing for a month but listen to merchants from the hills who talk as if he were a storm." "Men always mistake men for weather," Oberyn said. "Weather cannot be bribed. Men can. Can the mountain be bribed?" she asked. "No," he said, "but the ones who hold his chain can be made to think they are pulling it when the truth is different." "We will talk again at dawn," she said. Sleep. Sleep did not immediately come to him. He lay in the small chamber given to him and counted the breaths it took for the torch outside his door to gutter, flare, gutter. He pictured Nymeria's grin and the way Tyenne's eyelashes had brushed his cheek and Obara's knuckles struck against a training post. He pictured Doran's hands quiet on the chair's arms. He pictured the river running around the castle, indifferent, unwavering. He pictured a mountain whose base was the blood of children. He rose before the light and went to the place where the hall opened out into the courtyard. A few men were already awake, for the air had a bite that woke those who did not have a blanket and those who had had nightmares with equal efficiency. He walked the perimeter and measured it with the particular intelligence a man acquires when he has been asked to fight in many rooms with many different ceilings. He found the guard who looked bored but whose eyes were the most alive. He learned his name without asking for it. He walked to the edge of the water and considered how fast a man would drown if his hands were bound in front of him, and whether that was faster than if they were bound behind him. He picked up a handful of gravel and let it fall 1 stone at a time. At dawn they sat again. Maps were unrolled like fresh bread. Fingers pressed here and here. Words like Oxcross and Ashmark and Harrenhal and Golden Tooth were said and set on the table so he could learn their taste. He asked what his men always asked when they entered a new place. Where does the grain come in? Where does the piss go out? Who empties the chamber pots? Who sells candles? Who bakes bread for the guardhouse? Who delivers hay to the stables, and to whose daughter does he give a ribbon once every 6 weeks? They answered as best they could. Brynden had answers. Catelyn had answers. Robb sometimes had guesses which were often right because the young have instincts that older men squash with caution. Oberyn drew the lines between those answers. He made a net they had not seen and placed it over the lion's lands in his mind. He saw where it would sag. He placed his own weight upon one knot. By noon, an agreement that was not yet an oath had been crafted. It could be polished into an oath or broken into coin if need be. Oberyn would dispatch a rider toward the Prince's Pass and then to Sunspear with a letter written in a hand that was his at its fiercest and Doran's at its bones. A Dornish girl with a spear would ride not far behind that letter with 6 companions and 2 women who could make a room clean with 3 gestures. Robb would write to the twins and then not wait for the raven to answer but send bread and a fiddler. Brynden would send men to the hills to make the mountain believe that his shadow was narrower than it was. Catelyn would write to her brother at the Stone Keep and ask him to put aside his stubbornness long enough to let a particular rumor slip through his fingers and not be caught again. That afternoon, Oberyn walked through the market under the castle walls, where men whose wares were not worth the space inside the gate still came to sell because men with coin would drink anything when they were scared and bored. He bought a wooden whistle for a coin from a woman whose hands had knots at the fingers. He gave it to a child who had been staring at Ariohota as if the captain were a carving that moved. The child took the whistle and did not blow it. He put it in his mouth and chewed. Oberyn supposed it would make a sound later. In the evening, he climbed to the battlement and looked out over the river and the far fields. He could not see the sea. He did not need to. He could feel it like a muscle at the base of his neck, a tug that told him where his body would like to lie down if it had its way. He was not in the habit of giving his body its way. He held the spear like a staff and thought about Elia until the anger warmed him from within. A step behind him made him turn just enough to acknowledge without surrendering his view. Robb Stark stood with a cloak fastened high. The air was clear and took sound and cleaned it. Robb came to the parapet and leaned his hands on the stone so that his fingers showed white at the tips. He stood in silence in the manner of a boy who has discovered that he can make silence a kind of tool. "Do you know," Robb said eventually, "what it's like to be certain you are right and then be told that does not matter?" "Yes," Oberyn said. Robb nodded as if that were both comfort and admonishment. "I will send for the girl," he said, "and I will write to the man with too many sons, and I will see if a song can be a kind of bridge." He stayed a long time looking, then added, too quietly for anyone else to have heard, "I miss my father. I miss my sister," Oberyn said. "You will go on missing him. It will not reduce in intensity so much as change shape. One day you will look at your own hand and see it is his, and you will have to decide whether to put the hand down or use it." Robb's laugh was one that had learned the new limits the world had placed upon it but refused to be entirely soured. "You talk like no one I have met," he said. "I talk like a man who lived in the desert and learned to count how far the water is and how far he can make himself go without it," Oberyn said. "And then I left the desert and learned that it is all desert everywhere unless people choose otherwise. One may live on figs and fury, but not for long." They stood together for a time, not friends, not anything so easily named. It was enough to know that history would have to find both their shapes later and fit them into a picture that had not yet been drawn. Within 3 days, the castle had adjusted to the presence of Dornish men, as if the air itself had been taught a new step. The cooks learned that certain spices were better roasted first. The boys in the yard learned to hold a spear differently if they wished to keep their teeth. A letter left the East Tower with one of Oberyn's men who could ride all day and then do it again and who claimed he could sleep while a horse did too. A second letter left with a raven, and Catelyn's hand bound it as neatly as she might have bound a wound. A girl, Obara, because Oberyn had asked and she had refused to let anyone else be honored in her stead. Packed a bundle and a love of argument and set out with her companions while Oberyn stood at a window and pretended not to watch her go. At the meadow south of the twins, cooks set up pits and spit goats and busied themselves with onions and sweet herbs. A fiddler who had spent a year in Old Town playing in the corner of a room where men argued about words and paid in copper for sound tuned and tuned and tuned until the air itself wanted to dance just to make him stop. Brynden Tully made a table stand that had been rickety for 10 years stop wobbling with 3 pieces of wood and a wedge of swearing. Robb Stark had a chair brought that belonged to no king and sat in it so that men would remember that kings were men who sat, not men whose chairs did the work. Oberyn waited. He was good at waiting. He sharpened his spear with a slowness that made the act into a prayer to a god he did not love. He sent 2 of his company up the river to speak to a fisherman who had once sold trout to a man who wore a lion sewn in thread on his collar. He spoke to a woman who washed linens for the Lannister men when they passed through and learned they had a fondness for a certain kind of honey cake that could be baked with less honey and more spice without men noticing if they were feeding at twilight under torches that made everything sweeter. He told the cook that. The cook pretended not to hear and then used the spice. He wrote to Doran and carefully did not write, "I am happy." He wrote, "The boy has a slow burn to him." He wrote, "The woman has more steel than any man in the room but does not let it clink." He wrote, "The old fish has eyes like door hinges." He wrote, "Send gold." He wrote, "Send patience." He wrote, Send the promise that you will not sell me when I do what I will do." When the first of the phrase arrived with smiles like knives, Oberyn stood slightly behind Robb and a little to the left so that anyone who looked would see the king first and then the shadow of a man with a spear and wonder which one would be more expensive to offend. He watched them measure the tables with their eyes and the women with their habit and the distance to their saddles with their fear. He watched them wonder what the music meant. He watched one bastardy boy swallow envy like a man swallows grit and resolves to live. He stood and counted, and Areo counted, and the air itself seemed to count with them. The braiding had begun, and how tight or loose it would be was something no man could know yet. Oberyn only knew that there had been nights when he had thought he would never again feel the particular sweetness of a plan that was not wicked and not pure but might be useful. He felt it now, at the corner of his mouth, and he let himself smile because there was still so much to do, and a smile is a good way to keep a blade from slipping in a man's hand at the wrong time. Across the meadow, the river ran on. It did not care for banners. It did not care for oaths. It cared for rocks and banks and the way wind touched its skin. In its indifferent, tireless language, it prepared to carry everything that would be thrown into it, triumphs and bodies and pieces of wood and small whistles chewed by children, down to a mouth that would eat and never be full. The first of the phrase came with pins in their cloaks that had been polished until they thought they could see themselves improved there. They made short bows of practiced economy and let their gazes stray at once to the smoke from the spits, to the bright crockery that had been scrubbed until the glaze shone. Robb stood to greet them with the gravity of a boy remembering a lesson, and Oberyn marked the faces that flickered when they realized the king in the north would rise for them. Instead of let them approach a throne that would not fit in a meadow. "Welcome," Robb said, and the word had a weight because his mother had taught him that welcome is not a door flung open but a door on a hinge that must be swung at the right moment. Hosteen Fry, broad across the chest, a mouth that seemed perpetually bruised by disagreement, spoke first because the others always let him. "My lord father sends greetings," he said, "and observes that your fire's smoke leans toward our bridge. Then we will have warmth between us," Robb said, and his eyes gave nothing away. Oberyn's smile showed for a breath before he folded it away again. One of the younger phrase, a boy with the long bones of someone who had grown too fast in winter, studied Oberyn with the fascination young dogs have for sharp sticks. Oberyn's gaze moved past him gently and then returned, letting the boy know he had been counted without being made into a warning. Brynden Tully, at Robb's shoulder, inclined his head the exact measure required to acknowledge both courtesy and its limits. "You are welcome at the king's table," he said, "as you have been welcome at ours when this field was only a field and no king stood upon it." The phrase took that in with the dull patience of men who were used to being reminded where they fit in the furniture of the Riverlands. They were shown to seats not at the high table and not in the dust. They sat where their necks would not ache from looking up, and they did not complain because there was meat and because no one had arranged the tables in the shape of their bridge. Robb looked down the row and back again, as if tallying the number of bites it would take to keep men speaking to one another through the awkwardness of the first course. Catelyn's mouth set and aligned. Her eyes moved and kept moving. Oberyn ate with modest appetite, letting the flavors register and be stored away, the fat loosened by rosemary, the onion that had not had enough time, the bread with a crust that would have satisfied a soldier accustomed to saving a piece for later and smelling it as if it were a lucky charm. He spoke little to the phrase and less of himself. He allowed them to ask questions he did not answer in the way they thought he would. He asked one of the bastards, the one whose envy was the most articulate feature of his face, what he thought of the fiddler, and the young man startled and said with disarming candor, "He plays like a tree when the wind is not sure whether to begin." "Just so," Oberyn said, and flicked the boy a glance that would keep him from being struck later by uncles who preferred their bastards to be quiet furniture. As the afternoon lengthened, more of the fry brood arrived, like a hand emptying pockets into a bowl. They came in little clusters, each with its own choreography. The solemn, the sly, the pious, the sullen. A girl with a narrow mouth and eyes that could have been kind if anyone had let them spoke to Catelyn with care, and was rewarded with a laugh so gentle and brief that only the first part of it made it into the air. A man with a wife's envy riding his shoulder like a blue jay found himself seated by a woman from the Dornish company, whose knife was not visible and whose attention was never fully on him but always fully somewhere. Toward twilight, when the smoke took on the colors of the lowering sun and the flies had become too slow to be anything but a mild nuisance, they came with the palanquin whose poles had been oiled until the men who carried them could pretend the weight was less than it was. Inside, the old man sat among cushions that kept sighing as if each had a complaint. His hands were wrapped in yards of thin cloth to keep the cold from chewing. He had a mouth that curled when he saw that the chairs here had been chosen with deliberation. "Walder of the Crossing," Brynden Tully said, with the particular bite of long habit dulled by patience. The Blackfish had fought a lifetime's worth of polite wars at that bridge. "Blackfish who thinks a nickname is an armor," the old man answered, and let his gaze swim to Robb's face as if he could decide his opinion of the boy with the movement of one eyelid. He lifted his fingers an inch in the general direction of minimal courtesy. "King," he added as if pronouncing a verdict that did not quite satisfy him. His eyes slid to Catelyn and paused. "Cat," he said, and the old familiarity of the name did not require the permission he had never asked for. He had been rude too long to begin to learn grace. Lady Catelyn's reply had the softness of leather worn smooth by use. "Lord Walder," she said, "thank you for coming." "Thank me with bread," he said, "and with your boy's obedience to the first promise he made me. I am a simple man." No one said, "Simple men do not bring palanquins and speeches to meadows." That was the first courtesy of the twilight. Robb stepped forward and held out a cup. The wine in it had been chosen because it was good enough not to insult but not fine enough to give hostages to rivals who would remember vintages. Walder took it, sniffed it like a dog asked to eat vegetables, and sipped as if a predator might have been hiding there all along. "Adequate?" he said to the boy, and something in Oberyn's chest, where mischief and strategy shared a space like coiled snakes, unwound a little. This would be a conversation, not a sermon. "Good. You'll eat with us," Robb said. "We have enough seats for all who came." Walder's gaze traveled the meadow, the tables, the tents whose ropes had been checked twice where they crossed because a man's pride should not be left at the mercy of a knot poorly tied. Walder's mouth made a small curve. "I will walk," he said unexpectedly. Two of his sons began at once to protest that the ground would test his joints, and that the damp would eat his bones, and that the air itself was a robber of comfort when the light waned. He scowled. "Shut your lips," he told. "D them," and then looked at Robb again. "If you think you can walk while being a king, come along and prove it." Oberyn felt his eyebrows come up like birds. He had called it. He had not expected the old man to choose it. Robb glanced at the Blackfish, who pretended to be a movable stone to which no boy would look for strength, and then at his mother, whose mouth did not move and whose eyes warmed a finger width, and then nodded. "I'll walk," he said. Brynden moved a half-pace as if to follow. Oberyn stepped to his side and lifted the spear a fraction. "If you would let me earn my supper," he murmured without moving his lips enough for anyone else to read them. "Let me walk in their weather." Brynden's eyes were coins that had been rubbed by many hands. He made no sound. He shifted his weight the tiniest bit, and in that movement was permission and a quiet warning that if Oberyn stumbled he would be stepped over. They walked down to the river, not in a straight line, because there were men who had laid their cups on the grass and ropes that did not care if kings tripped. Walder leaned on a staff as if it had been given to him by a godswood. He did not look at the water when they came to it. He looked at the ground as if it were a ledger, and he pierced each entry with the tip of his stick. Robb matched his pace with an effort that made the muscles in his jaw show and vanish, show and vanish. Oberyn fell in on Walder's far side, a half-pace behind, ease making room for watchfulness. "You run fast for a boy with a crown," Walder said without looking up. "But you keep running into things." "I've been running toward my enemies," Robb said. "It's hard to avoid them if you intend to meet them." Walder grunted, a small sound that could have meant assent or hunger. "You promised me a girl to warm the mold around your oath," he said. "Then a raven tells me you have found warmer." Robb's mouth went thin. "I broke a promise," he said. I made another to a woman who had saved my life twice. I am sorry for the first. I will keep the second. I cannot unmake either with words. Words are the only things men throw that do not break when they hit. Walder sniffed. You should throw them more carefully. He paused then, as if to listen for something in the river which would tell him if the fish below were loyal. He spoke again with a new softness that did not flatter him and did not flatter anyone else. You know how old I am, boy? Oberyn watched the boy consider whether the truth would be useful. Robb chose it as a man chooses to step into a river where the rocks are visible. Old enough to see your own end coming slower than you'd prefer. Old enough to want it to leave behind more than a ledger of tolls. Walder's laugh was not a pleasant sound, but it was real. He said, you have lips that can manage more than meat. He thumped the stick down once, hard enough to make mud jump on Robb's boot. So, you have come to eat my bread and tell me I am necessary and make it seem as if you chose it rather than I. You have come so I will open my gate for your men now and at the next flooding and after. You have come to bend. Do you think I do not see that? I am old, not blind. I have come to put truth before pride, Robb said, and Oberyn saw Catelyn's hands teaching him how to hold a cup without showing the tremor. Your bridge is the vein in this arm of the river. It is the neck of a great beast. You can choke it. You can feed it. You can ask it to sing. I am not here to pretend you are less than you are. I am here to ask you to be more. Walder stopped. He turned his head with exaggerated slowness to stare at the boy. His eyes had the dusty glint of stones far down a dry well. More? He said, and there was avidity in the word, the hunger of a man who has lived long enough to suspect that everything is a bargain and yet still wants a pearl that cannot be bought. More than a toll, Robb said. More than a gate, a memory. I will grant a charter that stones the road to the twins with the names of those who cross. It will be written that during the war the safety of the crossing was kept by Walder Frey, and that when men were hungry he fed them, and when they were running he slowed them because haste is the enemy of reason. I will declare each year a day I will call the day of the crossing, and men will bring you gifts meant to pass from one side of the river to the other. Honey from the far orchard, cloth from the near loom. Your children will sit and watch as little ones walk across and are made into men and women by the naming. Your bridge will be a place where men become something else, not only a place where they pay. Walder listened with the greed of a man who has always made men feel small, and now found that he was being made large in a story that would outlive even his resentment. He said nothing for the length of 5 slow heartbeats. He then flicked his gaze to Oberyn as if to catch him smiling. Oberyn did not oblige. He simply stood like a man with patience enough to be invited into another man's vanity. And what of the girl you promised me? Walder said finally, as if putting his foot down on reason again because he knew its shape and liked it more than this new thing which asked him to consider how men would speak of him when the meat ran out. Catelyn had said that hostages were currency. Oberyn felt the weight of the next words like a coin between thumb and forefinger. He made a small sound, the ambassador clearing his throat and stepping into the dance where appropriate. If I might, he said. Walder turned his head the other way, the way old men do when they intend to hear with the ear that suits their conclusion. You have something shiny in your pocket too? Desert snake? Only this, Oberyn said. My daughter. I am not so old as to admit that the word makes me turn my head, Walder said, but his mouth twitched. Name her. Obara, Oberyn said. She rides Wel. She fights better. She will drink your wine and tell you if it is weak. She will live under your roof while she watches the river. She will remind my brother that there is something of mine sitting at your table and something of yours sitting at mine. She will be treated as a guest who will also be buried if she dies in your house. He smiled, showing teeth. And if she is wronged, I will become unpleasant in ways I prefer not to list. You may consider this both guarantee and gift. Walder's eyes narrowed like a slit in a shutter. I do not like to be threatened. I like to be honest, Oberyn said. Honesty often sounds like a threat to those who are accustomed to getting their way because others are too frightened to tell them what their way costs. Robb made a small hand movement he might have learned while brushing snow from a wolf's back. "I will give you this as well," he said quickly. "My uncle is not yet married." The words cost him. They cost him a quiet hope that had been shelved someplace for winter. "If you have a daughter who would like a good man who makes a poor husband for his stubbornness but a good father for his steadiness, I will ask him to meet her." Walder's face altered, not beautifully. He was a miser counting treasure and finding a coin he had not expected in the back of the drawer. His mouth opened and closed. For a moment he was not the Lord of Crossings. He was a man with too many posterity branches and not enough good stories to make them hold together. "Edmure Tully is fine for a trout," he said grudgingly. "He sulks. He fishes. He has eyes for his own reflection in a pool. But he is not a drunkard and he is not a sadist, and I have known too many of both among men who thought themselves rare birds." His gaze sharpened. "Would he do it?" Oberyn answered while Robb's breath was still moving from question to question. "He would do what his house asked of him if the request came from someone whose grief he respects," he said. Then he glanced at Robb. "Or he will do it because you are better at scowling than he is." Walder barked a laugh that startled a duck from the reed bed. The bird flapped up, indignant, and then returned to its precise business. "Bring him to me tomorrow, then," Walder said. "I will show him 6 girls. He will choose one and I will pretend it was his idea." He heaved himself forward a step, then another. The stick stabbed the ground. "As for your charter," he added, "write it. Read it to me while I eat your cook's honey cakes to see if they have any honey in them at all. If I like the sound of it, I will tell my men to open my gate for your wolves. But I will make one demand." "Name it," Robb said. "I want a song written," Walder said, "about me, not about your crown, not about your dead father or your future children or your battles. I want a song about an old man who kept the river for fools who thought they were the river. I want it sung at your court once a year by a singer with all his teeth. And I want a verse for each of my favorite names so that when those fools are dead their names will still be singing while I sit in the godswood and wonder why I am still alive." Robb blinked. He was not prepared for this. He was prepared for demands written on parchment and hung upon hooks. Oberyn's mouth made that small curve again. He had long believed that all men secretly want a poem. He would have laughed if he did not love the neatness of it so well. "It will be done," Robb said, with the seriousness of someone accepting a sword. "You will have your song." Walder stopped, and this time when he looked at the water he saw it, truly saw it, as if he had forgotten to for 30 years. The surface moved with a secretive generosity. It accepted every insult and made them into something unreadable 2 miles downstream. "I," Walder said again, softly, and the sound had less vinegar in it. "A man could be a bridge to more than coin." He looked then at Oberyn with something uncomfortably like gratitude and disguised it in his next words. "Your daughter will eat my best meat." "She will complain anyway," Oberyn said, and the old man's mouth twitched again, and Oberyn knew he had done the necessary work. He had turned a miser's mind toward a better extravagance. When they returned to the tables, torches had been set and the fiddler had found a tune that lifted men's feet of its own accord. Caitlin watched their faces as they approached and took in the little signs. The slackening of Robb's shoulders, the brittle satisfaction in Walder's mouth, the quiet light in Oberyn's eyes, and she let her own breath ease, just a finger's span. Brynden stood from where he had been speaking to a man who had not realized he had confessed to envy of another man's waistcoat. His expression did not change beyond a tiny shift in the angle of his chin. He would be told. He would grant his nephew neither overmuch praise nor any more scolding than the boy had already learned to give himself. They ate, they drank. No knives appeared where they should not. Freys, who had brought grudges as if they were gourds to be exchanged for meat, found their gourds misplaced and, distracted, ate without complaint. The night folded around the meadow like a careful cloak. When Walder was helped back toward his palanquin, he paused and hissed at the bearer who had placed a knee wrong, and then he reached as far as he could and tapped Robb's wrist with 2 fingers. "Do not die before my song is finished," he said. "I will haunt you." Robb smiled in a way that had no laughter in it but had the promise of it. I will try, he said. Catelyn's hand touched Oberyn's sleeve as men and torches moved. The contact was brief. Thank you, she said, and the words had the weight of a woman who had learned that she had only a limited supply of them when they mattered. You have put a plank. He inclined his head. We will need a bridge, he said. But plank by plank is how even the greets. T-spans begin. Hota watched them all from the margin with the serenity of an altar in a small, clean shrine. His eyes moved. His breath did not announce itself. When Oberyn came to stand near him, it was as if two wells had found a common water table. Ario asked no questions. Oberyn spoke no summary. They shared the space between them like men share a loaf in silence, content to chew and think of how to make the next loaf less coarse. Obara arrived 3 days later, sleepless and bright, with a gash on her shin that looked like a line of red ink. She swung down from the saddle as if the horse were an argument she had won only just. Behind her came 2 women with bundles and a boy leading a mule that had decided that obedience was a way to differentiate itself from the other beasts of the world. The mule raised its head and brayed once in the courtyard as if to announce that it had opinions. Men turned their heads. Men always turned their heads when a woman with a spear walked into a place men thought was theirs. Catelyn went to meet her and did it simply, without any of the ceremony that would have made the moment into a spectacle. Welcome, she said. You must be hungry. Obara grinned with her whole mouth and inclined her head the smallest angle that would not be insult. I am always hungry, she said. For meat, for news, for the chance to make someone who thinks he is invisible swear loudly. I bring all those hungers with me, my lady. I will feed what can be fed, Catelyn said. She glanced at the gash. And clean what ought to be cleaned. My companions have tried, Obara said, rolling her ankle with carelessness. They lick like cats. One of the women, her hair coiled under a scarf that once had been blue, snorted. We do not lick your mud, she said. We have standards. Hota watched Obara with the fond suspicion of an uncle who does not claim the title. She came to him, touched her fist gently to the haft of his axe, and then passed by without words. They did not pester each other with greetings because it had been decided that they belonged to the same story long before either of them could cut meat. Oberyn embraced her as if she were both daughter and comrade and then held her away by the shoulders to look at her face, as if the shape of it might tell him whether his plan had offended the gods in some manner. He found it unaltered, fierce, amused, stubborn. He breathed, and some coil inside him loosened that he had not admitted was tight. That night Obara sat at the high table as if she had been born in that seat and told a long and complicated story about a man with a cart full of melons who had refused to let her pass on a narrow road, and how she had convinced him not with insults but with the promise of a new song she invented for his mule. She sang the song in a voice that had the rough, pleasant texture of unpolished wood. It had a chorus of iya that made men laugh and clap the table. Walder's least favorite son, by bad luck seated near enough to be infected with joy, tried to keep his face sour and failed as the song stuck in his mouth like honey. Between the courses, Oberyn wrote. He wrote the charter that Robb had promised, the flowing sentences that placed the twins in the geometry of the realm not as a gate to be bewailed but as a throat to be cherished. He wrote the first lines of the song Walder wanted, merely the bones and a refrain that would be easy enough for any wandering singer to decorate with leaves later. He wrote to Dorne. He wrote to a captain whose ship sat outside the stone teeth of the stepstones and whose purse had already learned the weight of Dornish coin. He wrote to an old lover in Gulltown with a question disguised as a joke and to a smith in Lannisport with a question disguised as a compliment. He wrote until the candle sputtered and placed a damp finger over the wick to put it to bed. Dorne received the letters and arranged them on a table as if he were setting out a game his bones could still enjoy. He sat where the light made the ink look older so that he could better imagine what it would read like later when Oberyn's script would be a relic and not a voice. Arianne stood across from him with her fingers light on the wood. She did not reach for the parchment. She watched her father's face the way a person watches a horizon when they have learned it will betray them with storms. Oberyn is playing his instrument, Dorne said, when he had finished the one addressed to him, and his mouth warmed a little. He will turn the world with a song if he can. Will it turn? Arianne asked. She had learned that good questions make rooms bigger. It is turning, Dorne said. The question is whether it turns under our feet or away from them. He tapped the letter. He has put our child in the middle of a table far from our son. Our child put herself, Arianne said. Do not deny her the generosity of that truth. Doran's hands paused above the parchment in a quiet benediction. She did, he said, and it makes me proud and ill. He reached for another letter, the one that bore the careful, tidy script of a boy who had become a king as if by falling backward up a flight of stairs. He read without showing the effort it took for his eyes to keep their attention upon lines that wanted to jump. He writes like his father did, he said, and the sentence carried sorrow like a vein in marble. He does not waste words. He does not lie even when lying would make him better. That is a virtue and a hazard. What does he ask? Arianne said, though she had already begun inferring it from the way her father's jaw had set. Time, Dorne said. Patience. Gold. The promise that in 3 months' time, if he has held his bridge and eaten his bread and found the mountain. He paused, as if marking the capital letter within the line. Near enough to throw a rope at, that I will send him not my banners, but something that looks too much. Like them to make the men in King's Landing sleep well. He wants us to be an army that is not an army, Arianne said. All men want that, Dorne said. But only when the army is someone else's. I will send him what I can. I cannot afford to spend my people on another man's vow. I cannot afford not to either. He looked up. We are at the edge of sand and water. The desert will swallow anything that does not move. The sea will drown anything that does. Oberyn swims. I must teach myself to float. Arianne came around the table and, without asking, took his hand briefly. She had her mother's boldness in that, and her father's quiet in the way she did not press. I will write to the Ironwoods, she said, and to the Wills and the Fowlers and the Danes and all the people who like to pretend they choose their hearts in solitude. I will write to them as if we are gossiping and tell them that men are writing a song about a bridge, and that if they are not inside the rhyme, they will be outside it. Doran's smile tilted. You do that, he said, and tell the cooks to keep lemons in my rooms. The lemon cushion? Arianne asked wickedly. The other kind, Dorne said. He sent for Hodora's cousin from Norvos. If cousin was the word that could hold the complicated weave of loyalty and shared training, and the way the great beard of Norvos turned men into kin who had never shared a cradle. The man arrived with a face like a slab and arms that had known the happiness of single tasks done repeatedly. He knelt and did not speak because Areo had taught him that the first lesson in any hall is silence. You will ride to Skirich, Dorne said. You will tell them their gates are to be as open as their faces and as guarded as their hearts. You will say that the prince's pass belongs to Dorne and that Dorne will not be stepped on. You will take 3 men who can ride in rain and sun and not complain to anyone in my earshot. He folded the letters he had written to go with the man and sealed them with the sun and spear. And you will listen for the word that says the mountain has leaned toward the river. In the stepstones, where rocks punched out of the water like knuckles and boats darted between them like clever insults, a man who had never seen a desert counted coins into a sack and tied it to the spar where he would place his foot later when he needed to steady himself. He spit into the sea out of habit, to placate a god he did not believe in but did not dare insult. He read the note from a prince whose face he had never seen and dined on the idea that he was important enough to have caused the note's ink to dry. He raised his price to the next Lannister factor who came aboard to ask whether he liked the look of the lion. He said he was fond of cats, but not recently. He sold his ballast to another ship and made the man think it a favor. He did not move when a storm was threatened in a letter sent days before because he had learned that sometimes storms walk slower than ravens. Near Harrenhal, the mountain's men made a camp that looked like a bruise on the land. Boys ran errands with their heads down. Men sharpened knives because it was a sound that kept ghosts away. The mountain himself sat with his helm at his side like a skull recently cleaned. He ate as if eating were an obligation. He slept without changing position because no one had ever dared to slide a dagger between his ribs while he did so, and the habit had become not arrogance but evidence. Qyburn moved in his shadow like a leaf that had been kept to press and had somehow wriggled free. He asked his soft questions. He found the boy with the quiet feet and put a hand upon his head, not unkindly. He put a hand upon a wounded man and made him think it was a blessing. He asked where the grain was, and the answers came like mice, squeaking, skittering. The man who held the mountain's chain, if such a beast could be chained, was a captain who liked to think he understood men. He drank the wine brought by a baker's wife who had a dimple and a husband with a fear of horses. He sat a little too long in a chair outside a stable because the air was cooler there and because a boy had told him that the wind carried rumors in from the river like gulls. When he stood, he did not notice the grit under his boot that made him place his weight differently for 3 steps. Habits are nets. Nets are how predators eat. Catelyn wrote to Edmure with a hand that went steady in crisis as at birth. She told him as simply as folding a shirt, "This is the girl. Take her. Make a life. Be joyful if you can, dutiful if you cannot. Choose a day soon. Do it near the bridge but not on the bridge. Keep a hand on your heart while you stand so that you do not forget what you are for." Edmure received the letter with a look that made the men around him look to their boots, because it is not a comfortable thing to see a man about to be asked to give away a fantasy he had carefully pruned into something he could live with. He folded the letter once, twice, and tucked it into his breast. He went to the water and threw a stone in and watched the circles. He returned and told the man who shaved him in the morning to be careful with the notch near his ear. He told himself stories about girls with veils he would never meet. He asked the gods to make him less vain and knew as he asked that the gods prefer men with habits they can use like tools. Obara surveyed the room that had been given to her and found it adequate. The window had its latch. The door had its bolt. The bed was a little too soft but would teach her to sleep without listening for scorpions. She unpacked what little she carried and placed her spear where she could teach an intruder the lesson of the first step. She found the women assigned to her, one stern, one with a tongue like a ribbon, and told them both a story that made them laugh. Afterward, she sat on the sill and watched the yard where boys practiced at being men. She itched to humiliate them lovingly. She caught herself and decided she would wait a day before snapping their pride in two. A woman's generosity sometimes lies in not telling the truth until the truth will make rather than break. Oberyn moved through the castle like a fine thread pulled through cloth. He did not snag, but he left a line men could trace if they wished. He learned the names of the men who carried the ash buckets and the woman who patched linen and the boy who stood on a crate to reach the top shelves of the buttery. He asked questions no one had thought important and remembered answers no one expected him to recall. He laughed with 2 men who hated one another until their laughter occurred at the same time and then left them quickly before they remembered to separate again. He also stood still and did not move for long minutes in the yard when the sun was at its lowest. Stillness is a weapon. He had learned that from the women of the desert who could make a man confess simply by outlasting his discomfort in the heat. He let men come to him. He let rumors approach like feral cats who could be coaxed into closeness with patience. He allowed himself to be seen. He did not seek. At night, Robb came sometimes and stood with him where the wall meets sky and pointed with his chin. "There," the boy would say, "that is where we will go if the fry lets us." Or, "That is where the scouts saw the punctures in the wheat that mean men were searching for something more than grain." Or once, "That is where I sat when my father told me that fear is a poor horse to ride because it stops when you need it to run." Oberyn did not give him speeches. He gave him sentences that could be turned over in the hand. "Fear is the right horse if you ride it bitless," he said once. "It will learn to move to the pressure of your knee." And another night, "You will be asked to be 3 different men at the same time. Be 2. See if anyone notices." And gently, the night when Robb's voice had the thinness that exhaustion gives to even the strong. "If you are very lucky, you will come to hate everything you love about this. Then you will be safe from pride." The mountain moved. He had heard, as men like him do, the whispers that a prince who wanted him alive had come into a house that was not afraid to pronounce his name. He did not fear a prince. He feared nothing, as men mean nothing. He feared patterns breaking. He feared the interruption of habit, because habit was the only god he knew. When the order came to ride north with a handful of men to put an iron hoop around a small, stubborn village that had fed someone who spoke to robbers and to bells, he went. He took his dogs. He took Qyburn. He took a sense of ease that had been built by a careful hour-by-hour stacking of moments in which men's needs were smaller than his appetite. He did not think anyone could put a rope around his neck. Oberyn had learned years ago that ropes are a series of fibers, and that cutting 3 is sometimes enough. He did not raise a band like a song that would lift men into certain death. He sent 2 men out of the castle who looked like men with nothing to sell, and told them to sell their nothingness to a particular sort of buyer. He sent a woman with a basket of yeast to a baker whose wife had a friend who took in shirts from a house whose steward counted coins he did not always proclaim. He sent Hoda's hand signal to Brynden Tully, who lifted 2 fingers and then drew a line in the air, and sent men who could be quiet and not proud, men whose pride was in the silence itself. They did not seek to capture the mountain by his head. That would be a fool's work and a martyr's desire. They would capture him by his hands and feet, as one catches any great animal. Not by overpowering its strength, but by feeding it a story about its own strength until it steps into the shape you have made for it. The story they fed him was this: there is a storehouse near the river where the harvest of 3 villages has been hidden under salted cloth. A man inside has a key. He is a drunkard who would sell his mother to buy better drink. He will be waiting on a night when the moon is low, leaning against a door with a cup. The mountain believed in drunkards. He had trained his contempt on so many of them that it had become muscle memory. He rode with Qyburn and 7 men and left the rest to keep the camp around the bruise. He found the storehouse. He found the man. He found the cup and the sway and the smell of poor ale. He found the key held too loosely in a hand made for wheat, not iron. He found the door that opened with a sigh and the shelves stacked with sacks that, when cut, gave out a smell like comfort, like a winter without starvation. He smelled the set of chains that had hung there once to hold cattle before slaughter. He smelled old sweat and the flattering sweetness of spilled grain. He did not smell the pepper until it was too late, thrown in a cloud that did not require anyone to be strong to lift it. He did not see the first net because it had been woven of old fishing line, near invisible in that dark, and hung from a beam with a counterweight that made it a toy in a child's hand. He did not mind the blow to his knee. He had been struck 10,000 times. He minded that he could not stop falling. He fought, of course. He fought in the way rivers fight a dam, by insisting they are not water but force. He threw a man against a post and heard the wail, and something inside him, not cruelty, something like curiosity, said yes. He bellowed. He clawed the net and the net bit back. His men surged with him like splinters in a flood. Qyburn was pressed against a wall with neither fear nor courage in his eyes, only the quick movements of an accountant whose books have gone violent. Hoda stepped in then, as planned, with the stillness preceding him like a second skin. He did not jump. He did not shout. He placed his axe where it would ask questions, and he did not let it bite farther than a warning if a man's hand went where it had no business. The first rope went around the ankle, and the second, and the third. The great man got one arm free, and someone went down with a scream they would not admit to later, but it was enough to make caution climb the necks of the others. In the end, it was not a storm. It was a practical matter. Men in numbers do practical things well if they have been taught. The mountain went to his knees, and the floor creaked because floors remember. The chain went around his wrists, and the chain had been checked by 3 different men with 3 different prides. He roared. The chain did not care. He tried to bite. Someone loosened a strap into his mouth with the efficiency of a midwife's child. He bled. Not too much. The smell of the pepper equalized the room's air so that even gods would have sneezed there. When he was bound enough that even the wind would not have freed him, they took the nets off and let his skin feel its size again. It is an indignity to be made small by rope. He would live long enough for indignity to be new to him. They brought him not to the castle in daylight, not in a procession that would have made poets ruin their ink with adjectives. but at dawn, when the air is honest and men too sleepy to lie easily. He shambled because men do when their feet are leashed to the earth. The dogs ran silent, insulted. Qyburn walked behind with his hands folded as if he had just left a chapel. The village where the storehouse had been was quiet behind them, having learned for 1 hour how to hold its breath. Catelyn stood in a gown that could be washed and not wept over and watched them come. Brynden Tully stood like a door. Robb did not stand at the gate. He stood in the yard because he had learned that men who need to get through a gate will say whatever the gate wants them to say. But in a yard there is space for truth to travel. Oberyn walked forward and did not let his face do anything but accept the morning. He stopped at a distance where the mountain would measure him and think his spear too small. He stood and let the man look at him as if measuring meat. "You," the mountain said through the strap, the word more breath than meaning. "Me," Oberyn said. The word had no violence. It had weather in it. "I asked for you alive. I am grateful to the men who believed that I wanted what I said." The captain who had held the chain the cleverest looked as if he had expected a different reward. Oberyn did not make him restless with a glance that would be read later as withholding. He would feed that man later in coin, and in a kind of story the man would tell himself in bed to keep his hands from shaking. Now was not for that. "Take him below," Brynden said. "Take him to the room with no echoes." "There is no such room," Oberyn murmured, "but I will take the one closest to it." They brought the mountain to a chamber beneath the castle where the air did not move unless someone opened the door, and the droplets on the stone had not fully decided whether they would become mold or salt. He could not stand fully upright there, which was not a cruelty. It was simply the truth of the ceiling. He scoffed it, and the sound was loud enough to make the mice in the wall pause in their own rituals. Oberyn stood a little outside the threshold, letting Areo fascinate the air. He did not step inside. He could have. He did not because he wanted to own the space just before. The line men must cross to become what they are about to be. Catelyn came to the doorway but not beyond it. She had no want to look again into the face of a kind of man she had decided long ago not to understand. Robb came and held himself very still, as if any motion might spill a future he needed to keep in the cup of his hands. Brynden entered as if he had been entering rooms like this since boyhood. It had not made him worse. It had not improved him either. Areo stood to one side and allowed himself the luxury of closing his eyes for one breath, like a man arriving at an altar and opening his palms. Qyburn tried to walk in beside the mountain and was delicately stopped by a spear haft placed between his forward foot and the line of the floor. He looked down, not surprised. He looked up. He smiled his little dry smile. "I am a man of delicate implements," Oberyn said. "You will be told when delicacy is needed. You may wait in the room beyond and not become a conversation." "I have not come to argue with nobility," Qyburn said, and took half a step back as if the room itself had explained its rules to him. They chained the mountain to the ring in the wall which had held little before, and would remember this grip until the castle fell into the river one day, and even then. He flexed once, twice, and the iron spoke to him in the language it uses to tell men who is older. He breathed. He watched. He waited for the first fool to speak. Oberyn did not oblige. He stood. He let the seconds conduct their orchestra. He allowed the silence to make everyone else decide what kind of silence it was. Then he said to Robb, but also to the walls, "Alive." "Alive," Robb agreed. Catelyn's hands had gone pale from their own compression. She loosened them slowly, as if they were separate creatures of whom she wanted to ask favors. "What now?" she asked, plain. "Now," Oberyn said, and picked his words as if he were picking herbs in a garden where some look like others and a man can poison a stew by carelessness. "We feed him. We treat his wounds. We let him sleep with a chain in his dreams. We do not speak to him as if he were a god or a beast. We speak to him as if he were a man because it will make him weep when he cannot show it. We do not kill him. We do not torture him. We simply insist that he live long enough to answer, and in answering, to stand near what he has avoided. You intend to put him on trial," Brynden said slowly, taste-testing the words. "I intend to put the world on trial before him, Oberyn said. He will be a mirror. If men looking into it see themselves, some will tear their hair and blame the mirror. Some will go away and change their hair. Some will break the mirror and cut their hands. He let his mouth soften then, for Catelyn's sake. And I intend, he added, to learn who told him where the nursery was. He did not say Elia's name aloud there. He did not need to. The air in the room bent around it as if it were a stone beneath the water, shaping the current without being seen. They brought food. They brought water. They brought a maester who had been told more than once that he must stop talking when frightened because he spoke to keep fear from making a home in his lungs. The maester talked anyway but managed to keep his words within the polite boundaries of the man he wished to be, not the child he had been. He rapped a cut. He noted a swelling. He asked if the man had pains in his head and got the slow smile which is the acceptance of pain as a guest. He backed away and did not trip. Above, in a chamber where the sunlight fell squarely, Obara cleaned her spear and whistled a tune that had drifted up from the yard. She felt the castle's breath change and did not need to be told why. She stretched her leg and winced and called herself an idiot and went on. A boy from the kitchens brought her a visit in the form of a bowl, saying, "My mother says you will complain if there is not enough pepper and then complain if there is too much, so I am not afraid of the answer." And she laughed and ate and then told him he had not salted it enough, and both of them felt better. Walder Frye sent a message in the morning written by a clerk who had learned to write as one learns to hold one's bladder during a sermon. Long practice and small motions. It said, with an economy of flourish, that he accepted the charter and that his grandchildren had chosen verses and would provide their names in the order in which they would like to be sung. It added that he had selected a girl and that Edmure might see her veil when he arrived at sunset and that he would be made to like her because she played a harp and had a face like a spring pear and because Walder would make him. Beneath, there was a scrawl that might have been the old man's hand, more pressure than ink, looking like a bridge from an unskilled mapmaker. Edmure came that afternoon in a tunic that did not flatter him. No tunic ever would. He had the clean face of a man who shaved himself because he did not trust anyone else to move a blade that near his throat. He had the polite dread of someone about to be happy against his better planning. He made the little jokes men make in the face of obligation, that the weather was precisely tuned to his desire to sweat, that he had always wanted to be given a wife not by the gods but by geometry, that he was grateful that good archery was not a requirement of marriage because this thing he could do. Brynden clapped him on the shoulder without saying anything the boy could interpret as "I told you so." Catelyn kissed him on the cheek with the ferocity of someone who understands that joy sometimes needs help to register in a man who thinks too much about honor. Oberyn, who had known many weddings, stood near and decided to be both present and invisible. Rosalind Frye was not a girl men wrote sonnets about under good lamps. She had a glow that had not yet learned it owed nothing to other men's opinions. When she lifted her veil, Edmure did not smile with greed. He smiled as if he had been given a tool he hadn't known he needed. He bowed, not too deeply, and when he lifted his head he was taller because he had chosen to make himself so. Rosalind, who had been told she would be married like a parcel delivered by a man with ink-stained fingers, watched his face very carefully for the first lie. She did not find it. The old man had a chair set up to watch as if he had arranged a stage. He sat with blankets tucked and a satisfaction that made his eyelids heavy. "If you blush, girl," he said to Rosalind without taking his eyes off Edmure, "you do it because I told you to." Rosalind did not blush. She did something harder. She kept breathing. Edmure took her hand and did not squeeze it as if daring her to yelp. He held it like a man holds a small bird in a room where someone is throwing shoes. The thing was done. It was a wedding that took place in the middle of a series of wars, which is to say that it had all the trappings of joy and all the economy of an emergency blessing. The bread was broken. The wine was sipped. The vows were spoken after being explained as if to children because everyone had learned that when the stakes are high one should not be elegant with the words that bind. There were witnesses. There was food. There was music. There was not enough of anything beautiful, but there was enough. And sometimes enough is more than everything when someone has made up their mind to be grateful. When the new couple were led away with laughter that could have become cruel in other circumstances, but here did not because the men leading them remembered their own nights and were compassionate, Walder called out in his papery voice, And now I want to hear the first line of my song, Boy King. If it is bad, I will die this winter to spite you. Robb glanced instinctively to Oberyn, and the prince inclined his head, stepping forward with an ease that made men forgive him for being himself. He lifted his hand for quiet that came more because people wanted to hear a new thing than because they respected him. He said, "On the river's narrow throat an old man set his chair, where every hungry season walks in honest, shivering air. He weighed the feet of princes and the boots of barefoot men, and counted out the crossing so the world could turn again. It was not finished. It was not perfect. It had a cadence that made other men hear the lines they would add when they sang it to themselves for comfort one day." Walder closed his eyes. A smile happened to him without his consent. He waved his hand. "Go on," he muttered, half irritated at his own pleasure. Oberyn obliged with another stanza, and then he stopped because he understood the economy of delight. The fry gates opened, not in full extravagance, but enough for Robb's men to cross in disciplined lines while the old man watched with counting eyes and felt, perhaps for the first time, that his ledger had more than coin in it. Not all the host went. That would have been folly. Enough went that the map shifted. Enough went that men at other tables far away looked up from their bread and felt the wind change in rooms that have no windows. In the chamber below, the mountain breathed. He learned, against his will, the small humiliations of being alive in chains. The itch he could not reach, the dryness of a throat he could not relieve without asking. The staleness of air that did not change just because he wanted it to. He learned, too, the new geography of a world in which his name did not open doors. Oberyn visited him each day and did not ask questions for the first 3 visits. He stood. He brought water, which Ario poured into a cup that had a chip on its rim. He watched the way the man drank. He did not say Elia. He did not say mountain. He allowed boredom to become a mirror as he had promised. Men in pain seek distraction. Men in narrative seek climax. He told the mountain silently that neither would arrive on any schedule he could predict. On the 4th day, he asked about a horse. "The one you rode before the red cloak," he said. "Was its name Dancer, or was that the one you bought from a man who lied about its knees?" The mountain's eyes changed a little, like a quarry pool when a cloud passes. "You don't know," he said, his voice rough. Oberyn smiled. "I know many things," he said. "The pleasure lies in choosing which ones to say." He visited Qyburn in the room just outside, where the former maester had found a way to make himself useful to the men who were told not to find him suspicious. Qyburn had arranged his tools on a table with the care of a pious man placing icons. "You are a curious one," Qyburn said to Oberyn, "for whom curiosity is not only an excuse." "I prefer desire to excuse," Oberyn said. He pointed at a little saw, polished as if it enjoyed its own reflection. "Tell me which men you admire." Qyburn did not bother to hide that he found the question useful enough to be answered. "Those who learn from pain without insisting all lessons must be written on someone else's skin," he said. "Those who do not say, 'Thus has it always been,' as if it were an argument. Those who can take a world apart and put it back together minus a few of its cruelties." "Can you?" Oberyn asked softly. Qyburn's gaze went to his hands. "I have taken things apart," he said, "and put them together again?" "I have learned," Qyburn said, "and learned that men do not like to be told that what we are made of is more malleable than they prefer." Oberyn leaned with easy disgust. "Men who prefer to look upon cruelty as a table on which they have the right to eat do not like many things," he said. "I do not prefer the fear of their dislike to the harm of their habits." He left Qyburn to his clean instruments and went to the yard where men were practicing with swords that had learned to fall in love with their owners. He found Robb there, not fighting but watching, with his arms crossed and his brow furrowed in a way that suggested he could feel where a man's strike would land if he did not move his hip. "The business with the phrase has loosened," Robb said without preamble. "But the far houses are restless. Letters come with the smell of perfume we cannot afford. There is talk of a Tyrell host moving with the grace of a wheat field. There is talk of debts that will be called. There is talk of the sea waking like a lion. Let them talk, Oberyn said. Your job is to act when talk has built a scaffold that men mistake for a tower. You make a sport of my fear, Robb said, but he did not resent it. He had learned, quickly, that men who make everything heavy cannot carry anything far. I make a sport of making you see where its teeth are, Oberyn said. Then you can choose whether to put your hand in the mouth. He watched a boy overextend and get a dull blade wrapped smartly on his thigh. The boy hissed, caught himself from cursing, and then looked toward the women on the scaffolding who were doing their mending and not watching at all. You will need 3 things to keep moving: bread, bridges, and a way to tell your men the truth in such a manner that it feels like a prize. I have the first today, Robb said. I have the second because of you. The third. He grimaced, young suddenly, and then wiped the expression away because men were watching. I am learning to like it. You will fail at it once, Oberyn said. You will lie because you are in haste. You will lie because you are tired. Your men will forgive you the first time. Your mother will not. I suggest you be good at apologizing. I have had practice, Robb said, and the shadow of Fry oaths went over both their faces and then passed. You will stay, he added, almost pleading and then not pleading because kings do not plead, they ask, and because he knew Oberyn disliked being asked anyway. I will stay for a time, Oberyn said. Then I must go back to my brother and remind him what it is to be made of patience without being eaten by it. How did you become who you are? Robb asked suddenly. He did not blush at the impertinence. He had learned that questions are knives that draw blood only if the man you ask is insecure. By wanting too many things at once, Oberyn said, and then choosing which of them to feed. And by loving a woman who died, and by refusing to let the men who killed her tell me what I would remember most. Robb nodded. He did not pry at the wound. He let the answer sit the way one sets bread to rise under a cloth. I will send a letter to the Manderleys, he said instead sensibly. They have ships. They have appetites. They have honor and the habit of pretending they do not when it costs them. If they can be moved, I can move the coast like I moved the bridge. Good, Oberyn said. Tell them a Dornish captain owes me a favor and that if they make the right noises near the stepstones, the sea will become briefly polite. And you? Robb asked. What do you want now that you have your rope around his neck? Justice is an ugly word when served after it should have been, Oberyn said. I want to make a room where the truth can be said and not destroy the mouth that says it. I want him to speak, and I want the men who made him possible to be named. He looked toward the tower under which the mountain Saturday. Then I want him to die of something ordinary in a bed without banners. It will insult him. That is kinder than I expected, Robb said. It is not kindness, Oberyn said. It is art. In Sunspear, Dorne paced a path between 2 lemon trees that had learned to be content in pots, for the soil was not deep there. He received a letter sealed with the hawk and the key and the vine, and he broke it with the practice of an old man who has had his heart broken repeatedly by the absence of what he had wanted. It asked politely whether Dorne could be persuaded to do nothing while the rest of the world congratulated itself on enmities won cheaply. It used such terms as lasting peace and common prosperity and faith of the crown, and other phrases that sound fine in rooms without windows and foolish in rooms with only windows. Dorne rolled the parchment into a cylinder that could have been a spyglass. He held it up and looked through it as if it would show him the hawk perched on a stone. He saw instead the long arm of his sister reaching across years. He did not smile. He did not need to. He wrote back with courtesy and a single sentence that seemed harmless if one were a fool and a bomb if one had brains. Dorne prefers to keep its own counsel regarding future choices, as patience and memory demand. He sealed it and sent it by a man who walked as if he were carrying something heavier than paper. He then called the lords of Dorne to council, not grandly, not in a way that would alarm the capital, but in a series of dinners and rides and afternoons where men think they are merely resting their feet and are in fact being walked around. He asked them about water. He asked them about olives. He asked them about their nephews. He did not ask them about war. They understood. Arianne left the room that evening with her hair unbound and the taste of lemon on her tongue. She wrote to Oberyn by her own hand, which had not yet learned the formal stiffness his possessed when he was hiding his hunger. She wrote, "The snakes miss you when you behave like a rope. We are planning what we can without setting fire to our own skirts. The man from Norvos ate as if he had been starved and then slept. Father sends the gold you asked for and a voice that says yes and another that says later. Do not let them make you into a weapon they can throw at any target. Remember you are your own aim." She signed it with the little sign she had invented as a girl, a stingray with a crown, and sealed it with hot wax that took the shape poorly and therefore delighted her. Letters went out. Letters came. Men moved. Rivers ran. The earth turned the stubborn way it prefers. In the chamber below, Oberyn began carefully on the 5th day. "Tell me about the day you broke a man's hand because he took a plum from your basket," he said. He did not say the man's name. He did not say anything that would gild the truth. The mountain did not ask how he knew. He said nothing for a long time and then said, "He was warned," and watched Oberyn's face as if expecting to find there the condemnation that turns men into preachers. "He was hungry," Oberyn said. "So was I," the mountain said, without rancor. "And you prefer the hunger of others," Oberyn said. "I prefer not to be made to feel small," the mountain said. And there it was, the closest thing he would say to the universality that makes villains dull when they are honest. "Who taught you that smallness was an injury?" Oberyn asked. The mountain's mouth quirked. "My father," he said. "And yours?" Oberyn laughed, not because it was funny, but because men who say such things believe they have unhorsed you. "My father taught me to count," he said. "It is not the same lesson, but it can be used the same way." He did not ask about Elia that day. He asked about a horse whipped for balking at a stream and the taste of the dust near Casterly Rock and the color of a sunrise that occurred when the man had had a fever and hallucinated a woman he had killed coming to sponge his brow. He asked questions that made the man remember the softness of childhood for a breath. He asked about the road between one town and the next and where the boy had slept on it. He built a room. He would bring the name into it only when the walls were strong enough to hold it. He slept little. He wrote much. He allowed himself an hour the next afternoon to lie on his back in the sun on a roof and consider what it would be to grow old in a place where lemons smell like the hands of a nurse and the sea can be reached in a day. It seemed unlikely. He sat up and laughed at himself. He went to find Ario to ask him what the mountain looks like from the inside when you have chipped away at it with patience. Ario grunted a sentence that could have been a proverb if he had been a man who enjoyed such things. "Stone sometimes turns to sand before you reach the top. You must know whether you prefer sand under your feet or in your mouth." Robb Cross. Ed the bridge in the morning mist that made banners look like ghosts trying on dresses. The fry men stood to one side and muttered and counted and felt useful. Rosalind watched from behind a patched curtain and allowed herself to smile without permission when Edmure turned his head as if he could feel her eyes. Caitlin sat a long time in a chair brought to a corner of the yard and did not move because movement seemed like a betrayal of the small piece of peace she had found. Brynden directed the long tail of men and wagons with the untruth he told better than most anyone, that everything was under control. In the market, a man from the Green Fork sold knives with edges that would not hold and made a killing because men are more afraid of dull blades than they pretend. A woman who had promised her mother she would not bring another child into the world until the current one had shoes bought a length of leather and thought about making 2 pairs, one small, one imaginary. The fiddler with all his teeth learned the first 4 lines of the Fry song and sang them at a fire for 2 men who threw him coppers and a woman who threw him an onion. Across this small world, men in red cloaks turned their heads and felt a discomfort at the base of their skulls. They could not name it. They called it weather. They called it bad bread. They called it a need for sharper swords. Some of them called it what it was, news. And far away, in a room that looked out upon a garden where roses had been taught to grow in the exact shape of a lady's sigh, a man with ink that stained more than his fingers read a line that said an old man had agreed to be remembered. He did not frown. He did not smile. He did not do anything that might be interpreted by a servant who would repeat it to a chamberlain who would hum it to a duke. He sat. He drank a mouthful of wine so carefully that the surface tension did not break. He set the cup down as if the table might ask a question if he did it too quickly. He considered whether the song would be sung in his hall. He knew the answer. He wrote a letter that said nothing. He sent it. In the chamber below, Oberyn stepped to the threshold on the 7th day and said a name. He said it calmly. He did not put a weight upon it. He let the name be itself. It moved through the air and fitted into the room as if it had been carved to occupy a notch in the stone. The mountain flinched very slightly, as if a fly had landed on his cheek and he had stopped himself, out of dignity, from brushing it away. He breathed twice. He exhaled. He looked at Oberyn as if the man had become taller by a small amount. "Say it again," he said hoarsely. Oberyn did. He added the name of a small boy and a small girl. He did not add the end. He let the names stand like 3 candles. "And what will you do with them?" the mountain asked. "That has not been done by everyone else who owns them?" "I will place them in your mouth," Oberyn said, "and you will hold them there until they melt." The mountain swallowed reflexively, and a muscle in his jaw jumped. He was not used to being told that his body could be made to do anything at someone else's pleasure. He thought of a woman who had once laughed when he struck her. Not madness, not defiance, laughter, and how it had made him angrier than any prayer. He thought of a boy who had hidden in a grain bin and had dreamed for 5 minutes he would not be found. He thought of a girl who had put her hands over her ears and hummed a tune that was somehow in the room now. He closed his eyes. No one spoke. Areo watched humility walk across the man's face slowly, as if its legs were tied. Oberyn did not press. He stepped back 1 pace and let the gravity in the room shift. He went up then into sun. He found Robb speaking with a man whose face was wind-burned and who smelled faintly of the river. He looked at the boy's face and saw that a weight had been added and that the boy was bearing it because he had asked for it when he went to war. He felt, absurdly, an affection for the boy that had nothing to do with strategy. It made him feel more vulnerable than he preferred. He flirted with the kitchen maid who carried bread past the yard to punish himself with a little foolishness. That evening there was dancing in the square beneath the west wall because someone had said, "We must," and then done it. Freys and Tullis and Northerners whose feet learned to step in mud and Dornish who would have preferred sand but made do with dust moved in circles. The fiddler with all his teeth let men think they knew the tune, then shifted it slightly so that their feet were forced to pay attention. Obara danced badly on purpose and allowed 3 boys to believe they had taught her something. Brynden clapped on the offbeat to see who would be brave enough to correct him. Catelyn smiled, and this time it made it into the air and stayed long enough to brush a child's ear. Oberyn stood at the edge with Areo, who had removed his axe and leaned it against a barrel with the care one gives to a sleeping child. "Do you dance?" Oberyn asked. "Only when I will not be made a story of," Areo said. "You are already a story," Oberyn said. "Then I will be careful," Areo said. They did not dance, but they swayed a little, and the motion was so subtle that only a woman who had watched lovers at windows would have noticed. In the days that followed, the world continued to turn in its stubborn way. Men in lion cloaks found themselves paying more for bread. Ships that had always passed into Lannisport without delay were inspected by men whose livelihoods had acquired new, Dornish clarity. A letter arrived from White Harbor with a little fish drawn in the corner by a child and a postscript written by a large hand promising ships that have eaten storms and will not vomit. A rider came from the hills with a tale of a small village that had refused to hand a girl to men in red cloaks and had instead run. A bell that called a dozen men with bows whose strings sang in the mist. Brynden marked it on a map not because it would matter militarily but because it would matter when songs were counted and men who had done small brave things were deciding whether to do another. The mountain spoke when he spoke of small things. A leather thong, a stirrup, the way a man's foot drags when he is planning to turn left but lying about it. He did not speak of the nursery until the day he did. On that day Oberyn was not at the door. He was above, having his hair trimmed by a man who had learned to keep a light hand. Areo stood, as always. The mountain, who had been made to exist in a room where he could not pretend he was anything but a man, lifted his head and said, abruptly, in a voice not different than any other voice he used, the number of steps between the doorway and the bed where the boy had been. He said something about the light in the room at that hour. He said nothing of the sound. Ario's hand tightened on the haft of his axe so hard that it could have left marks in iron. He did not move. He did not speak. He waited. The mountain swallowed, and then was silent. When Oberyn came down later and Ario told him, he did not go inside. He stood as he always stood. He breathed. He said the names again, each separately, as one spreads 3 seeds evenly in a row, not caring that the next rain might move them. One evening, midweek between 2 months that the people of the Riverlands called by names the Dornish did not bother to learn, a rider arrived out of the west coated in dust that had been arranged by speed. He brought a letter sealed with green wax and a sigil that Oberyn had once drawn in a childish hand on a cave wall by torchlight. A dragon. The letter was brief and unhelpful. It said only that a woman had hatched fire out of stone, and that men in Pentos were telling invented truths because they thought the truth itself was too dangerous to believe. The rider had no more. He had heard a tune whistled in a market and had followed it because the tune had words about wolves and sand and cross bridges. He had thought, a boy's thought, that where the tune was true the truth might also be true. He had traveled 2 nights with a little fear for company. He had delivered a fairy tale to a man who disliked them. Oberyn read it, looked at the sky, and laughed. "There is room for more than one story," he said. He tucked the letter away, not because it would be useful, but because it made the world larger. He liked large rooms. He wrote to Dorne a single line. "The world remains ridiculous and we must be prepared to profit from it." Robb came and asked about the letter. Oberyn told him the contents. Robb blinked in a way that made his boyhood flash and go. "Dragons," he said. "Why not? You will lose if you wait for magic to finish the job," Oberyn said. "You will win if you do the work and then magic shows up late and insists it had been there all along." Robb grinned at that with a pleasure that was unfeigned. "I will keep sweeping the floors," he said. "If a dragon wishes to warm its feet, it will find them clean." He went to his men. He sent letters. He moved pieces. He remembered to eat. He remembered to sleep. He remembered the hand upon his wrist that had once tapped twice. "Do not die before my song is sung." He remembered a father's voice. He remembered a mother's eyes. He remembered a desert prince's small, private laugh. In Sunspear, Dorne stood at a window and watched rain. It was the kind of rain that feels like a guest who has overstayed by a quarter hour and then apologizes so well one lets them stay another hour. He thought of Oberyn out there making friends with the edges of things. He thought of Arianne writing to men who think they invent themselves each morning. He thought of his own ankles and the small treachery of bone. He closed his eyes and imagined a world in which he could walk a long distance for the sake of nothing but walking. He opened them again and returned to his chair with dignity. Men came to him for answers. He gave them answers. He did not give them what they did not know to ask for. That is how one keeps a kingdom. Not with noise, but with the careful distribution of silence. In the chamber below, the mountain asked for water and was given it. He lifted the cup with both hands because he had no other choice. He drank without spilling because dignity remains in odd corners. He lowered the cup. He spoke the names again without prompt. He said them with the flattening of syllables that is the last defense of men who will not cry. Oberyn closed his eyes. He did not order anyone out. He did not stay. He turned and went up and out and walked the circuit of the wall 3 times with a step that made men think he was counting. He was counting. He counted breaths until the air no longer felt like a knife. He counted the number of birds sitting on the parapet and then corrected himself when 2 took off. He counted the stones between 2 merlins and noted that one had a little triangular chip missing shaped like a tooth. He counted his own heartbeats until they slowed from the hurried work of memory to the honest labor of maintenance. When he was finished, he went to the yard and found Oberyn teaching a boy to keep his thumb outside his fist so he would not break it on a jaw he did not yet know he would aim toward. He watched. He learned the boy's name. He told him what men had told him in a dry room years ago when he had wanted blood more than breath. If you win, it will not fill the hunger. Decide whether you can live with that. The boy looked at him and, to his credit, did not ask for a different instruction. At night, the river went on. The torches went out one by one. The men who had sat at the tables and sworn and eaten and said clever things slept in positions their mothers would have recognized. Walder lay on his side and dreamed he was young and was angry. About it in the dream, Catelyn slept with her hands folded near her face as if to keep the quiet from falling. Robb dreamed he was hunting and that his father walked just beyond the edge of the wood and would not come when he called. Oberyn lay on his back and told the ceiling, quietly, another version of his sister's story, the one in which she did not die but sailed instead and the boat never arrived, so that he could feel the ache of difference and keep his weapon sharp. Could all still be lost? It could all still be ruined by a letter or a man's appetite or a mile's worth of rain that washed out a bridge built the day before. That knowledge made the meat taste better. It made the work feel less like a rote and more like a devotion. The War of the Five Kings did not stop because an old man wanted to be sung. Tilted, men adjusted the load upon their shoulders and walked on. The sand remembered their footprints and then forgot them. The water washed every name equally until it was asked, gently, to sing a few longer. When dawn came, it was a cold dawn that made men's breath visible. The fog along the river lay like sheep's wool expected to be cleaned. Oberyn took his spear and walked to the meadow where the grass still bore the marks of the tables. He stood where Walder had stood and looked at the shape of their doing. He turned slowly, a circle enacted, the measure of a day. He looked at the bridge. He looked toward the west, where smoke smudged the air thinly, the signal of a cook's impatience. He looked toward the east, where letters would come. He breathed. He smiled, small and complicated. He began to plan the next kindness that would look like a threat and the next threat that would feel like a kindness. He set his foot down on ground that had learned to bear it. He moved without haste, which is a kind of speed that does not frighten allies. And in a chamber below the earth, a man who had never believed he would fear anything but boredom said three names to himself in a darkness and understood, for the first time, that a rope made of small fibers binds as tightly as any chain. He did not weep. He did not curse. He slept, and sleeping was smaller. The world, having waited without shouting, got exactly what it had asked for. It would decide later what to do with it,